On the eastern bank of the Hudson River, where the water moves with the slow patience of centuries, there stands a house of pale limestone that has watched the world change from its high vantage point. It is called Kikuit. The name comes from the Dutch word for lookout, a place from which to see. And from this house, for more than a century, one family did precisely that. They looked out, they watched, and in ways that remain woven into the fabric of modern life, they shaped what they saw. Imagine the moment just before the world wakes. The mist rises from the Hudson in delicate threads, soft and almost weightless, as if the river is releasing memories into the cool air. The stone of Kikuit emerges from the grey, its surface catching the first pale light. The gardens are still, no gardeners yet, no visitors. Just the sound of water, and, somewhere distant, a bird that cannot quite decide whether morning has truly begun. The windows of the house reflect nothing yet. They are dark mirrors, keeping their secrets. How does a family acquire the power to reshape nations? Not through crowns or conquest, but through something far more subtle and perhaps more durable, through ledgers, through railroads, through the transformation of a substance that bubbled up from the earth, crude, worthless in the eyes of most, into something essential to modern existence. Through the construction of systems so efficient that millions of people depend upon them without ever knowing the name of the family that built them. And then, through the careful, deliberate turning away from that power, the channeling of wealth into institutions that would outlast the fortune itself. This is the puzzle that still confounds historians. How did one family, beginning with nothing but ambition and a gift for secrecy, come to touch the lives of nearly everyone on Earth, and then, gradually, invisibly, retreat into shadow? The answer is not a simple one. It cannot be told in headlines or in the language of heroes and villains. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to sit with contradiction, to understand how the same hands that built hospitals also crushed competitors, how the same mind that orchestrated the most efficient business system ever devised also felt the weight of a conscience that would never fully rest, how a fortune that seemed to represent the future of American capitalism would, in the end, transform into something its founder could never have predicted, and that would gradually slip away like the mist on the Hudson. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden histories that shape our world, to the stories of how power is obtained, wielded, and eventually released, then please subscribe to join us. The rise and fall of the Rockefeller Dynasty is a narrative that touches everything from the oil beneath our feet to the medicines that saved millions of lives, to the art museums and university buildings that grace our cities. It is a story that whispers, rather than shouts, about ambition and guilt, about efficiency and suffering, about the strange arithmetic of American success. So let us begin, as we must, in the obscurity from which all great fortunes emerge, not in the mansions of the Hudson, but in the spare, unsettled landscape of early 19th century New York, where a man named William Avery Rockefeller moved from place to place with little fanfare and less honesty, leaving traces that his own family would one day prefer to forget. His son, born in that same uncertain landscape, would take the ambition that William carried, that restless, driving hunger for more, and transform it into something that would echo across generations. But that transformation could only happen in the presence of something else. Discipline, bookkeeping, a devout mother's insistence on order and purpose, a mind that could see patterns where others saw only chaos. The mist on the Hudson continues to rise. The stone of Kikuit continues to hold its witness. And somewhere in the architecture of that house, in the careful placement of its rooms and gardens and in the weight of the fortune that built it, the story of a family's rise and the slow, intricate mystery of its eclipse begins to unfold, one detail at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of consequence leading inevitably into the next, until a man in Cleveland picks up a ledger and decides how to arrange numbers on a page, until he decides, without quite knowing it yet, to remake the world. The water is very still this morning, and the stone beneath holds the weight of nearly a century of decisions, secrets, and inheritance. What you're about to encounter across these hours is not simply a story of money, though there is plenty of that. It's the story of how one family, beginning from almost nothing, built the architecture of modern capitalism itself, and then watched that architecture reshape itself in ways they could never entirely control. How does a fortune grow so vast that breaking it apart only makes it larger? How does raw industrial power transform into something more durable, influence woven into the fabric of institutions, universities, hospitals, and art museums that outlive their creators by generations? These are the questions that pull at the edges of this family's history, questions that whisper across the rooms of their grand estates even now, long after the men and women who built them have turned to dust. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet architecture of American power, to the intersection where individual ambition meets historical consequence, to the strange paradox that sometimes destroying an empire is the only way to preserve a legacy, then this journey through the Rockefeller Dynasty is one you'll want to follow all the way through. Subscribe now so that as we move backward in time, to the muddy roads of 1830s New York, to the fever dream of the Pennsylvania oil boom, to the boardrooms where fortunes were calculated with the precision of a funeral march, you won't miss a single turn of this remarkable unfolding. There's something particular about the Rockefeller story that resists simple judgment. It is neither a tale of pure villainy nor unblemished virtue. Rather, it's the story of what happens when intellect, discipline, and ambition meet an industry at its moment of explosive birth, when rules are still being written and men of sufficient will can reshape them. It's the story of spectacular accumulation, of course, but it's also the story of what comes after accumulation, the long, often confused attempt to figure out what to do with power once you've seized it. The generations that follow ask different questions than the generation that built. They inherit not just the money, but the doubt, the conscience, the weight of being watched. So let us begin where all wealth begins, not with the glory, but with the hunger. Let us go backward, into the America that was just beginning to understand what oil meant, what speed meant, what the consolidation of resources into fewer and fewer hands would mean for the future. Let us meet the man who saw clearly before anyone else saw at all, who understood that in the space between chaos and order, a certain kind of mind could build something unprecedented. We're about to walk through mist-covered gardens and into the careful ledgers of history. We're about to trace the line from an itinerant peddler to the wealthiest human being in the world, and then beyond, to see what his descendants did with an inheritance so vast it came with a conscience attached. To understand how one family came to shape the machinery of American wealth, we must first travel backward through time to a place far humbler than Kaikouet, far simpler than the marble halls that would one day bear the Rockefeller name. The 1830s unfolded across upstate New York like a slow unfurling of possibility and restlessness. The Erie Canal had only recently cut through the heart of the state, opening vast territories to commerce and ambition. Small towns bloomed in its wake. The forest was still thick in places. The air carried the smell of raw timber and the faint promise of something new being built. It was into this world that William Avery Rockefeller arrived, though arrived is perhaps too formal a word for how men like him moved through their lives. He was an itinerant peddler, a man without fixed routes, traveling from one settlement to the next with goods bundled on his back, or loaded into a wagon, patent medicines, liniments, tonics of dubious merit and mysterious origin. There is something almost mythic about the figure of the American peddler in that era, moving through the landscape like a minor character in stories that would later be told by others. William Avery was one among thousands, yet something in his manner, in the way he moved through communities, set him slightly apart. History offers us fragments of the man, and fragments are what we must piece together. He was, by most accounts, charming. Charisma is a strange inheritance, and it would pass to his son like a latent gene, expressed in different forms but never quite absent. He was also, and this is perhaps more important to understanding what followed, a man of considerable secrecy. There are gaps in the historical record of William Avery's life that suggest he was not entirely transparent about his origins, his past, or the precise nature of his enterprises. Some accounts suggest he was not always honest in his dealings. Some hint at a darker history, though nothing quite substantial enough to pin down with certainty. Did he ever spend time in jail? The evidence is murky. Did he sell products that were outright fraudulent, making claims about their medicinal virtues that had no basis in fact? It seems likely, though one wonders if he himself truly believed in the remedies he hawked. Perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps he understood something that would echo through his son's life and into the lives of all who came after, that belief and reality are sometimes less important than persuasion and control. Somewhere during his travels through New York, William Avery met Eliza Davison, a woman of strong religious conviction and considerable moral certainty. She came from a family with some standing, some education, some sense of propriety and order. What she saw in the restless peddler is not entirely clear, but they married, and in 1839, in the small town of Richford, Vermont, just across the border from New York, their son was born. They named him John Davison Rockefeller. The household into which young John Davison was born was thus already marked by a peculiar tension. Here was a mother of Methodist conviction, deeply devout, shaped by the certainties of evangelical Christianity, the belief that God's will could be discerned and followed with precision. And here was a father who seemed to operate by different principles entirely, principles rooted not in conviction but in opportunity, not in transparency but in carefully managed obscurity. What does a child absorb from such a household? What does he learn when his mother speaks of honesty and his father's actions seem to contradict her words? One might expect such a contradiction to produce either rebellion or confusion. Instead, in John Davison, it seemed to produce something else entirely, a synthesis, a way of holding both worlds in his mind at once. The family did not remain long in Vermont. William Avery, true to his nature, moved them repeatedly, to New York, to Ohio, settling briefly, then uprooting again. A man who peddles for a living is by definition a man who refuses to take root, and yet roots, of a kind, were forming in young John. He was learning to observe. He was learning to listen. He was learning the subtle arts of attention and restraint. By all accounts, he was a serious, thoughtful child, not given to the rough play of other boys, more inclined toward watching, calculating, understanding how things worked. His mother's religious devotion was a powerful force in his young life. She taught him that discipline was a form of piety, that careful attention to one's duties was a way of honoring God. She taught him also that money, when earned honestly and managed carefully, was not something to be ashamed of. There is a particular strain of Protestant thinking that sees wealth as potentially virtuous, as the result of virtue, as a sign perhaps of divine favor. It would take root in young John and grow strong. But his father taught him something else, something quieter and less explicit. He taught him that the world operated according to rules that were not always stated, that information was power, that one could move through life without always revealing one's true nature or intentions. He taught him, perhaps unintentionally, that secrecy and strategy could be legitimate tools in the pursuit of one's aims. The peddler's life is a life lived partially. You show people only what they need to see. You tell them only what they need to hear. You never fully reveal yourself. Consider for a moment what happens when these two impulses, the mother's moral certainty and the father's strategic obscurity, meet in the mind of a single, intelligent, observant boy. What emerges is neither pure virtue nor pure ruthlessness, but something more dangerous, a mind that can convince itself that strategy and virtue are the same thing, that careful accumulation is moral, that control is a form of honesty. The towns of upstate New York in the 1830s and 1840s were rough, energetic places, full of energy and opportunity and disorder. They were the kinds of places where a man with ambition, but no family name, could still make something of himself. This is what America promised then, and it was not an empty promise. But it was a promise that required a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of willingness to operate in the spaces between what was explicitly forbidden and what was explicitly allowed. William Avery understood this. His son, growing up in this restless household, moving from town to town, observing his father's methods and absorbing his mother's values, was learning it too. The boy who would become the architect of American oil was born John Davison Rockefeller on July 8, 1839, in Richford, New York, arriving into a household already shadowed by his father's peculiar absences and moral ambiguities. By the time young John was old enough to comprehend the world around him, the family had migrated westward, following one of those restless impulses that drove so many Americans deeper into the expanding territories of the 19th century. His childhood was neither lavish nor deprived, but rather suspended in a kind of careful calculation, a household where money existed as a precise unit of measure rather than a source of pleasure or indulgence. Perhaps this is where it all began, not in any grand vision of empire, but in the very ordinary mathematics of a household learning to account for itself. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was a woman of quiet, unshakable Presbyterian faith, later Baptist conviction, and she possessed a temperament that seemed almost designed to shape a son who would understand the world through numbers and moral discipline. The records tell us she was meticulous, devout, and profoundly conscious of what she believed to be the spiritual dangers lurking in idleness and excess. She kept a strict household, where waste was not merely financially imprudent, but morally culpable, where discipline was not punishment but education, and where the accumulation of small virtues was understood to compound over time like interest on a ledger. When historians look back at the formation of John D. Rockefeller, they often return to her influence, to the way she appears to have instilled in her son a psychology of restraint and methodical self-improvement that would come to define not merely his personal habits, but the entire structure of his business philosophy. From his earliest years, the boy was taught to keep careful accounts. His mother gave him small sums to manage, tracking how he spent or saved them, and young John embraced this exercise with an intensity that suggests something deeper than mere obedience. He began keeping financial records, those precious notebooks in which he recorded every transaction, every coin received and expended, developing the habit of measurement and review that would later allow him to see the entire oil industry as a vast, chaotic system awaiting rationalization. Think for a moment about what this means. A child training himself not simply to earn money, but to understand its movement, its patterns, the subtle mathematics of small decisions compounding into larger ones. It is an intimate education in control, conducted in the privacy of household accounts and maternal approval. The family moved to Moravia, New York, when John was still young, and then to Owego, and later to Cleveland, Ohio, each migration marking the family's slow drift westward into territories of greater commercial opportunity. These were not dramatic relocations, but rather the quiet shuffling of an ambitious household seeking better prospects, and in each new town, young John appears to have been the same, focused, observant, slightly apart from the exuberance of other children. His schooling was ordinary but earnest. He attended local academies and commercial schools, the kinds of institutions that were beginning to emerge in America's growing towns, places where the children of merchants and traders learned the practical arts of business alongside classical subjects. But it was not in the classroom that his true education occurred. It was in the ledgers, in the daily practice of accounting, in the slow internalization of the principle that everything could be measured, that every activity had a cost and a yield, that waste was not simply unfortunate but morally indefensible. Perhaps the most striking feature of his adolescence is how little we know of any moment of joy or spontaneity in it. The letters and memoirs that survive speak of a boy who was industrious, steady, and marked by an almost premature seriousness. He was not, by most accounts, warm or particularly given to emotional display, yet neither was he coldly distant. Rather, he seems to have inhabited a kind of emotional clarity, a state in which feelings were present but subordinate to principle, in which affection existed but was expressed through duty and attention to proper conduct. His biographers have sometimes lamented this quality, wondering what was lost in a childhood so thoroughly subordinated to the cultivation of virtue and financial discipline, but one might also observe that he seems to have been, in his own way, contented. He appears to have believed in the system that was being taught to him, to have genuinely internalized the conviction that a carefully managed life was a good life, that discipline was not deprivation but a form of freedom. By his late teens, John Rockefeller had absorbed so thoroughly the lessons of his mother's household that they became invisible to him, not constraints imposed from without, but the very foundation of how he understood the world. He was a young man of perhaps 19 or 20 when he began his search for employment, entering the commercial world not with the exuberance of youth or the hunger of poverty, but with the steady determination of someone who has already mastered the fundamental art of self-governance. He possessed, by this time, something rare and difficult to describe, a kind of psychological readiness for the work of systematization, a mind that appeared almost relieved when confronted with disorder, as though he had been waiting all his life for the opportunity to impose order on chaos, and the oil industry, when he encountered it, would offer him just such an opportunity. By the time young John D. Rockefeller arrived in Cleveland in 1855, he carried with him something far more valuable than the modest savings from his bookkeeping apprenticeships. He carried a discipline so complete, so woven into his thinking, that it became nearly invisible to everyone around him. To his colleagues, he was simply a careful young man with steady hands and a gift for ledgers. What they did not understand was that every entry he made, every column he balanced, was training his mind to see the invisible structures beneath the visible world: patterns, order, controllable systems. Cleveland in those years was already a boomtown of sorts, perched on the southern shore of Lake Erie, a place where merchants and small manufacturers could feel the future arriving in steam and ambition. The city was less than 50 years old, still raw, still hungry. It had none of the settled dignity of the East Coast cities, none of their inherited hierarchies. This made it, for a young man without family connections or inherited wealth, paradoxically perfect. Rockefeller took work first as a bookkeeper and commission merchant's clerk, handling the accounts of various small trading firms. The records that survive from this period, and there are fragments scattered across archives, show something rather remarkable. His handwriting was precise, almost geometric. His numbers never wavered. But more than that, his entries reveal a mind that was already thinking several moves ahead. He would note not just what had been sold or received, but margins, seasonal patterns, the reliability of particular suppliers. In the margins of ledgers, he began to sketch calculations about hypothetical transactions. What if prices moved this way? How would profit shift if volume changed? He was teaching himself the mathematics of business, not from books, but from the daily flow of money through his hands. What might seem tedious to most minds became, for Rockefeller, a form of meditation. The act of recording, of organizing, of bringing chaos into order, This satisfied something fundamental in him. There are accounts from his early Cleveland years of people who observed that he seemed almost happy when faced with a tangled set of accounts, as if chaos itself was a kind of invitation. A merchant's books lay in disarray, and Rockefeller would sit with them for hours, his fingers moving steadily through page after page, and when he emerged, everything would be legible, traceable, rational. Around this same time, in the mid-1850s, something else was happening in Ohio and Pennsylvania that would eventually change everything. Petroleum was being struck, not in the quantities that would come later, not with the urgency and chaos that would define the oil boom of the 1860s, but enough that people were beginning to notice. There were small operations, mostly haphazard, mostly run by men who had no idea what they were doing, who pumped oil and tried to sell it as a kind of miracle cure, or for lamps, or for lubricating machinery. The oil was crude in every sense, unrefined, unpredictable, smelling of sulfur and ancient things. Most of the merchants and traders in Cleveland paid it little mind. It seemed marginal, ungoverned, hardly the kind of enterprise that a serious businessman would bother with. But Rockefeller, even then, was doing something that very few people his age were doing. He was looking at the world not as it was, but as it might become. The railroads were spreading like spider silk across the landscape. Lake shipping was growing. Manufacturing was consolidating. Where others saw random opportunity, Rockefeller was beginning to see, dimly perhaps, but with increasing clarity, a system. If you could process petroleum efficiently, if you could move it reliably, if you could organize the chaos of its production and sale into something rational and predictable, there might be money in it, vast amounts of money. This was still years away from any concrete action. For now, Rockefeller remained what he appeared to be, a young, unmarried clerk, living a modest life, attending his Baptist church regularly, giving small amounts to charity, saving his wages with an almost monastic dedication. He was living on a pittance even by the standards of the time, choosing to board in a simple house, eating simply, wearing plain clothes. His colleagues sometimes made gentle fun of his frugality, his refusal to spend money on even small luxuries. But Rockefeller was not suffering under his circumstances. He was in fact accumulating capital, slowly, methodically, with the same patience he brought to his ledgers. He was gathering the resources that would one day allow him to move. And there was another element, something quieter and perhaps harder to quantify, but no less important. Rockefeller was developing, through his work with numbers and systems, a kind of confidence. Not the flashy confidence of the riverboat gambler or the born salesman, but something deeper and steadier. A confidence born from the repeated experience of imposing order on confusion, of making sense of complexity, of finding the hidden logic beneath apparent randomness. Each time he balanced a set of accounts, each time he traced an error to its source, or predicted a trend from incomplete data, he was building something in himself, a belief that the world was ultimately knowable, that it responded to method, that patience and intelligence could unlock its secrets. What he did not yet fully understand, what no one could have told him then, was how this habit of mind would eventually reshape not just his own fortune, but the structure of American business itself. The ledgers he was keeping in these obscure Cleveland counting houses were, in a sense, the blueprints for something that would not fully take shape for another decade. But the seed was there. The seed was always there, embedded in the precision of his handwriting, the logic of his calculations, the patient accumulation of his savings and his knowledge. The world around him was beginning to move faster. The oil was beginning to flow. The railroads were connecting previously isolated regions into networks of commerce and capital. But Rockefeller, in these quiet years, was moving at his own pace, on his own schedule, learning the language of money and system with the devotion of a medieval scribe copying scripture. By the time the oil boom truly began, when the Pennsylvania oil fields erupted in a frenzy of drilling and selling and chaos, he would be ready. He would know how to read the ledgers. He would understand the hidden order beneath the apparent disorder, and he would have the patience, the discipline, and the capital to wait for the moment when he could begin to impose that order on the entire industry. To understand what young John D. Rockefeller would eventually build, you must first see the world he was stepping into, a world of such frenzy and chaos, such raw hunger and improvisation, that it seemed almost unimaginable that any single mind could ever bring order to it. The year was 1859, when a man named Edwin Drake, drilling near a place called Titusville in northwestern Pennsylvania, struck something that would rewrite the continent's destiny: black crude. Thick, abundant, flowing from the earth like a dark blessing that nobody yet fully understood. Within months, weeks, really, that remote corner of Pennsylvania became something closer to a gold rush than an oil field. Farmers woke to find speculators on their land. Small derricks rose among the trees. Men arrived by the hundreds, then thousands, drawn by the promise of fortune, their horses and wagons churning the earth to mud. There was a wildness to it, a sense that the normal rules of commerce had been suspended. Men worked by candlelight in crude wooden structures. They fought over claims with their fists. They drank in taverns and made promises they never kept, and fortunes changed hands in a single night over whiskey and handshakes. The oil itself was a puzzle. Crude from different wells had different properties. Sometimes it burned too quickly. Sometimes it was too thick to use efficiently. There were fires, terrible fires, and explosions in refineries that killed workers whose names nobody bothered to record. The men in the oil fields were rough, often desperate, working in conditions that seem almost unimaginable now. Yet they kept coming, because the money, when it came fast and bright and real. Refining was where the real complexity lay. Raw crude was nearly useless. You had to process it, heat it, separate it into different products: kerosene for lamps, lubricating oil for machines, fuel oil, gasoline that most refiners considered a useless byproduct to be burned away or dumped. A refinery was a small industrial miracle, part chemistry, part guesswork, part brutal trial and error. Early refineries were haphazard operations, often built near the oil fields themselves, though over time, the industry began to concentrate in cities with better transportation and access to capital. Cleveland, Ohio, emerged as one of the primary centers of refinement in the early 1860s, a place where the crude from Pennsylvania could be processed and shipped out along the railroads and water routes to markets across America and beyond. Picture Cleveland in the 1860s. It was a growing city, ambitious, positioned on Lake Erie, with good rail connections south and east toward the booming industrial regions. New refineries appeared almost monthly. Small businessmen with modest capital could start a refinery operation. There was room, or so it seemed, for many competitors, each scrapping for market share, each trying to claim a portion of this sudden, enormous demand for refined oil products. This was the environment John D. Rockefeller entered when, having left his clerking position, he moved into the oil business in partnership with Maurice Clark, a man older and more experienced than he was. They started small, as so many did. Their refinery was one among dozens in Cleveland, unremarkable in most ways, a modest operation that processed crude and sold the refined products to the markets that were now desperate for them. But here, in this noise and competition, we begin to see the nature of Rockefeller's mind more clearly. Where other men saw chaos, Rockefeller saw systems crying out for order. Where others saw a commodity, Rockefeller saw an opportunity to think about efficiency, about cost, about the seemingly small details that, when multiplied across thousands of barrels, could accumulate into something larger than anyone else had imagined. How much waste was there in refining? Could you reduce it? Could you sell the byproducts that other refineries simply burned? Could you negotiate better rates with the railroads if you shipped in larger, more predictable volumes? The oil business in these early years was intoxicating in its possibility, but also, for a reflective mind, deeply unsettling in its inefficiency. Prices for crude swung wildly based on news from new wells or rumors of supply problems. Refinery capacity vastly exceeded demand in some months, then demand exceeded supply in others, and prices lurched accordingly. There was no standardization. Competing refineries had no real connection to one another. Each was an island. Each was trying to undercut the others on price. Each was producing oil of slightly different qualities because there was no agreement on how refining should be done. For John D. Rockefeller, this was not a frustration to accept, but a problem to solve. By the mid-1860s, he had bought out his partner Clark and taken full control of what became the Standard Oil Company, initially just his refinery, but already the seed of something much larger. The name itself was telling: standard, uniform, consistent. It suggested what Rockefeller was beginning to believe, that the oil business didn't need to be a chaos of competing fragments. It could be rationalized, standardized. In 1865, Rockefeller was in his mid-20s, and yet he was already thinking in ways that most men twice his age could not grasp. While other refiners were focused on the daily struggle of production and sales, he was asking deeper questions. What if there could be one dominant refinery or several coordinated refineries that could produce at such scale and efficiency that smaller competitors simply couldn't match the price? What if you could control not just the refining but the distribution, the railroads, even to some degree the supply of crude itself? It's worth pausing here to note that these ideas didn't emerge fully formed. They developed gradually, through observation and calculation, through conversations with railroad magnates and other businessmen who were pioneering similar strategies of consolidation in other industries. The impulse toward monopoly, toward the gathering of all operations under unified control, was becoming a pattern of the age. Steel was consolidating. Railroads were consolidating. The logic seemed almost inevitable. If you could gather the scattered pieces, reduce competition, achieve economies of scale, you could produce more efficiently than any rival. The Pennsylvania oil fields continued to boom through the 1860s and into the 1870s. But with that boom came increasing instability. Wells in one region would be depleted, forcing prospectors to move to new territories. Prices remained volatile. The industry was beginning to understand that you could not simply leave such a valuable enterprise to pure market chaos. Someone would have to impose order, someone with vision and patience and ruthlessness. Someone very much like John D. Rockefeller. By the end of the 1860s, Standard Oil controlled perhaps 10% of American refining. It was the largest refinery in Cleveland, certainly, but the country was still dominated by many smaller competitors scattered across multiple states. To Rockefeller's methodical, penetrating mind, this was unfinished business. The work of consolidation was just beginning. The noise and violence and inefficiency of the oil industry had caught the attention of one man who understood that all of it could be brought under a single, rational system, and he was only just getting started. By the early 1870s, the oil fields of Pennsylvania had become something closer to fever than industry. Wells sprouted like weeds across the Appalachian landscape. Every small operator dreamed of striking it rich, and the market itself seemed as unstable as the ground beneath the derricks. Prices swung wildly from month to month, sometimes week to week. One month a barrel of oil might fetch $3, the next it might collapse to 50 cents. In such a world, small refineries operated at the mercy of forces they could not control, and most of them failed. This chaos was, to John D., Rockefeller, not a problem but an opportunity. Where others saw disorder, he perceived the opening for something unprecedented, the chance to consolidate an entire industry under a single roof. And he possessed a mind uniquely suited to the task, cold, methodical, patient, ruthless, though he rarely used that word about himself. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Rockefeller did not begin by trying to outcompete his rivals in the marketplace directly. Instead, he approached them with a simple proposition. Standard Oil would offer to buy their refineries, not at a premium price, but at a price he had calculated down to the last detail. Some owners accepted readily enough. They were tired, undercapitalized, and grateful for certainty. Others refused. For those who refused, a different approach took shape. Rockefeller began to examine the supply lines that fed the refineries. He examined the railroads, and here, the real leverage began to accumulate. Standard Oil, already a substantial shipper of oil, began to negotiate directly with the railroad companies for favorable rates. It was not blackmail in the legal sense, but it operated very much like it. Rockefeller would promise the railroads a steady, enormous volume of shipments if they offered Standard Oil rates that were lower, dramatically lower, than what smaller refineries paid for the same service. A small refinery might pay 70 cents per barrel to ship oil by rail. Standard Oil, by contrast, would arrange to pay 40 cents, sometimes even less. What happened next was quiet and inevitable. The smaller refineries, paying twice what their larger competitor paid for transportation, could not survive the price competition in the final market. Their margins evaporated. They could not sell oil cheaply enough to compete and still stay solvent. Some closed their doors. Others, seeing the mathematics clearly, approached Rockefeller's representatives with a question that had a predictable answer. Would Standard Oil be interested in purchasing the refinery? The answer was always yes, but the price was now even lower than it had been before. The owner was desperate. He had no alternatives, and Rockefeller knew this. He always knew this. It was one of the principles that governed his behavior. Wait until necessity bends the other party into acceptance. By 1872, Standard Oil had acquired nearly all of its competitors in Cleveland. Then it moved outward, expanding into the refining centers of Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and beyond. The same pattern repeated itself with methodical precision. Acquire, consolidate, reduce costs, eliminate competition, acquire again. But there was another dimension to this expansion that extended beyond simple buyouts and favorable freight rates. Rockefeller also wielded what historians have called the drawback system. In its essence, it was this. Standard Oil would arrange with railroad companies not only to receive discounts on its own shipments, but also to charge its competitors higher rates, and then to rebate a portion of those inflated charges back to Standard Oil. It was a form of systematic punishment wrapped in the language of commerce. Your competitor pays an inflated rate. Standard Oil receives a portion of that inflated payment as a rebate. Over time, the competitor becomes slowly strangled, while Standard Oil grows wealthier. The system worked partly because the railroads had every incentive to cooperate. Standard Oil represented a massive shipper, and the railroads desperately needed the steady, predictable business. There were moments when resistance formed. Some refineries banded together, trying to push back against these arrangements. Some appealed to state legislatures or to public opinion, but Rockefeller had prepared for resistance. He had made strategic friendships. He had cultivated relationships with railroad executives, with politicians, with judges. When opposition arose, it often found itself either ignored, outmaneuvered, or quietly dissolved through negotiation at a level above public view. Was this legal? The question hung over much of it. The answer was complicated. Some of what Standard Oil did was technically legal, or at least existed in a grey space where the law had not yet reached. Other practices were more questionable. But in the 1870s and early 1880s, the legal apparatus for stopping such consolidation barely existed. There was no Federal Trade Commission. Antitrust law was in its infancy. The railroads themselves were largely unregulated monopolies, free to offer whatever rates they wished to whomever they pleased. Rockefeller was operating in a landscape where the rules had not yet been written to prevent what he was doing. And so, by 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. It was a level of industrial concentration that had not been seen before in American history. One company, one man's vision, one ledger, increasingly, into which the entire industry was being written. How had he done it? Not through innovation in the refining process itself, not through superior technology or superior products. The oil itself was chemically identical regardless of who refined it. What Rockefeller had done was to see that the profit lay not in refining oil better, but in controlling the flow of oil through the system, control the railroads' relationships, control the supply lines, control access to capital, control the speed at which competitors could move, and if you control all of these things, the refineries themselves, the physical plants, the equipment, the workers, become almost incidental. They are captured by the superior logic of the system. There was something almost hypnotic about the efficiency of it. Rockefeller had taken the chaos of the oil industry and imposed upon it a kind of rational order. He had eliminated the wild price swings that had bankrupted so many small operators. He had created stability. And in creating stability, he had become immensely wealthy. These things were not separate. The wealth flowed directly from the imposition of order. But as Standard Oil swallowed refinery after refinery, as the consolidation accelerated and deepened, something else was stirring. In the newspapers, in the minds of politicians, in the consciousness of the American public, a question was beginning to form, quietly at first, then with increasing force. What happened to a society when one man could control 90% of an entire industry? What was the price of such efficiency, and who paid it? The Pennsylvania oil fields had made Rockefeller rich, but they had also shown him something more valuable than wealth itself. They had shown him the fragility of chaos. Dozens of refineries competed against one another in a frenzy of overproduction and price collapse. The railroads charged what they pleased. The market lurched between glut and scarcity, and in that violent unpredictability, Rockefeller saw not disorder to exploit, but a problem to solve through architecture. By the 1870s, as Standard Oil absorbed refinery after refinery through acquisition and consolidation, Rockefeller and his associates faced a peculiar legal obstacle. They could own competing companies outright, yes, but they could not easily coordinate their operations under a single management structure without violating state laws against monopoly. Each company remained technically independent, a shell, and so, in the quiet offices of Standard Oil, a lawyer named Samuel Dodd proposed a solution that would remake American business forever. It was called the trust. The mechanism itself was elegant and, for its time, almost invisible. Shareholders of the various Standard Oil subsidiaries would place their stock certificates into the hands of a board of trustees, Rockefeller and his associates. In exchange, they would receive trust certificates that paid out dividends. The trustees would then control all the stock, directing the strategy and operations of dozens of separate legal entities as though they were one organism. It was centralized power wearing 100 legal disguises. Picture it this way, if you can. In the quietness of the evening, imagine you owned a factory, and you gave your ownership papers to someone you trusted, asking them to make decisions on your behalf. Now imagine thousands of people doing this for hundreds of companies all at once. The person holding those papers, in this case Rockefeller, suddenly possessed the ability to coordinate pricing, to eliminate redundancy, to negotiate with railroads as a unified force. The trust structure transformed a loose federation of competitors into a hydra that could think and act as a single consciousness while remaining legally fractured. What made this innovation so potent was that it solved a problem no one else had quite articulated. The modern industrial economy was growing faster than the law could contain it. Corporations had become too large and too interconnected to be managed by 19th-century contract law. The trust, in Rockefeller's hands, was not a loophole so much as it was an honest answer to a structural question. How do you manage coordinated enterprise across multiple legal boundaries? And the answer, it turned out, was to separate ownership from control, to put property in a legal box and let one mind direct it from outside. By 1882, the Standard Oil Trust controlled roughly 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. It was not that Rockefeller had grown greedier than other men, it was that he had found a tool that other men did not yet understand how to use. The trust structure allowed him to think longer, plan deeper, and coordinate more thoroughly than any rival could. Where his competitors fought each other in regional skirmishes, Standard Oil played chess across the entire continent. And because the trust seemed to produce real efficiencies, lower costs, more reliable products, better service, it was difficult for outsiders to articulate exactly what was wrong with it, even as they felt the grip tightening. The beauty of the trust, from a certain angle, was also its danger. It created what you might call a semi-visible concentration of power. The trust certificates existed, the trustees' names were published, and yet the actual mechanism by which decisions were made, the flow of authority from certificates to control to operational strategy, remained opaque to the public eye. A shareholder might own part of Standard Oil and receive their dividend without fully understanding what had been done to earn it. A consumer bought kerosene without knowing it came from a refinery coordinated through a structure that had no legal name a few years earlier. This innovation spread. Other industries, watching Rockefeller's success, began forming their own trusts. Whiskey trusts, cotton oil trusts, lead trusts. By the 1890s, the trust had become the dominant organizational form for large American business. It was neither a merger, the legal entities remained separate, nor a cartel in the traditional sense. It was something new, and in that newness lay both its power and the fury it would eventually provoke. What Rockefeller had created, perhaps without fully intending to, was a template for how to exercise power without formally holding property. The trustees did not own Standard Oil. They controlled it. They did not employ the workers directly. They directed those who did. It was a form of authority that was real, extensive, and almost impossible to restrain through existing law. The trust became, in effect, the skeleton key that unlocked the potential of industrial scale. And because it worked, because Standard Oil did produce efficiencies and lower prices, at least for some, it seemed, for a time, like the future. Yet there was something almost somnambulistic about how completely the trust succeeded. Rockefeller had not seized power through force or political connection. He had simply organized property in a way that the law had not anticipated. No king had crowned him, no election had elevated him, and yet by the mid-1880s he controlled the petroleum supply of the entire nation, which meant he held influence over the transportation, heating, and lighting of millions of people. The trust structure had made that possible, and in so doing, it had raised a question that America had never quite faced before. What happens when private power becomes indistinguishable from sovereignty? Yet in the quiet offices of Standard Oil, where every penny was accounted for and every competitor absorbed into the larger whole, there lived a curious tension, a tension that would come to define not just Rockefeller's later years, but the very nature of American capitalism itself. Because what we must understand, if we are to understand the unease that would soon ripple through the nation, is that Standard Oil was not, by the measures of its own time, entirely inefficient. This is perhaps the most troubling part of the story, because efficiency in business is a value almost beyond reproach. When Rockefeller consolidated the oil refineries of America under one vast umbrella, he did not introduce chaos. He introduced order. He reduced waste. Pipelines that had been redundantly laid were unified. Refineries that duplicated effort were consolidated. The very science of extracting, processing, and distributing petroleum became more rational, more systematic, more economical. A barrel of oil that might have been refined by 5 separate companies, each taking its own share, now flowed through a single, streamlined machine. Cost fell, supply became reliable. In an era when kerosene lamps lit American homes, Standard Oil made that light steadier and cheaper than it had ever been before. So we must sit with this paradox for a moment, because it is not comfortable. Monopoly, in its pure economic form, is not inherently sinister. A single producer, unburdened by the waste of competition, can sometimes deliver more abundance at lower cost. This was the seductive logic that Rockefeller himself believed, and it was not entirely false. Yet something within the American conscience, something that had been born in the founding documents and nurtured through generations of frontier mythology, recoiled from the very idea of such absolute concentration, not because it was always inefficient, but because power itself, when pooled into a single pair of hands, seemed to violate something sacred. The fear was not economic in nature alone. It was psychological. It was moral. Consider the position of the small refiner in Pittsburgh or Cleveland during those years. He might have been a competent businessman, a skilled engineer, a man of genuine ingenuity, yet in the face of Standard Oil's reach, its capital reserves, its ability to undercut prices until he had no choice but to sell or starve, what choice did he truly possess? This is where the mathematics of efficiency breaks down into something more ominous. Yes, Standard Oil made kerosene cheaper, but it did so partly by making it impossible for anyone else to profit from oil at all. The efficiency was real. The coercion was also real. These two truths existed simultaneously, and that simultaneity troubled the conscience of America. In the drawing rooms of Eastern wealth, in the progressive circles of universities and reform societies, a new vocabulary began to emerge. Monopoly was spoken of as an unnatural thing, a perversion of the natural order that should govern commerce. The word itself, invoked again and again in pamphlets and sermons and political speeches, carried an almost religious weight. It suggested not mere business success, but a kind of corrupting sin. The competitive marketplace, as American thinkers had been taught to believe, was supposed to reward the virtuous and punish the lazy. It was supposed to be self-correcting, organic, fair in some fundamental way. When Rockefeller systematically eliminated that competition, he was not simply winning in business, he was violating the entire moral order upon which American capitalism was supposed to rest. This is what journalists began to uncover as the new century turned. Not that Rockefeller was inefficient or foolish, but that he had achieved something far more troubling. He had revealed that the moral order of the marketplace was not self-correcting at all. He had shown that a man with sufficient will and capital could simply remove the competition, not through innovation or superior service, but through the sheer application of power. And once you see the machinery of capitalism in that light, not as an invisible hand gently guiding equilibrium, but as a visible fist crushing alternatives, it becomes difficult to unsee. The public was not yet entirely certain what to do about this knowledge, but they could not ignore it. A collective unease settled over the nation, quieting and patient, like dusk gathering over a landscape. The question that began to whisper through town halls and newspapers was deceptively simple. Yes, Standard Oil makes kerosene cheaply, but at what cost? At what cost to the possibility of other lives, other businesses, other futures? At what cost to the idea that any industrious man might rise through his own talents, rather than depend on the benevolence or mercy of a monopolist. These questions were not asked by radical socialists alone, though socialists asked them. They were asked by conservative businessmen who feared they might be next. They were asked by clergy who believed in individual providence. They were asked by ordinary people who had been taught that America was a place where talent and virtue were rewarded. When they looked at Standard Oil, they no longer saw proof of that promise. They saw its negation. And what made this all the more complex was that Rockefeller himself, in his own understanding, had done nothing wrong. He had competed vigorously, yes. He had driven hard bargains, certainly. He had used his advantages to the fullest. But in his mind, he was simply doing what any intelligent businessman ought to do: consolidating, organizing, improving efficiency. He was not, as far as he believed, acting out of malice or corruption. He was acting out of the very virtue that America was supposed to celebrate, the virtue of creating order from chaos, of making something larger and more effective than what came before. That this larger thing had, as a side effect, crushed the ability of other men to succeed, seemed to him perhaps an inevitable consequence of progress, not a moral failing. Yet the nation was beginning to develop a different moral arithmetic. It was learning to ask whether the efficiency of one vast machine was worth the elimination of the possibility for many smaller machines. It was learning to fear not merely greed or dishonesty in business, but something perhaps more insidious: the concentration of legitimate power into hands so few that they ceased to be answerable to anyone at all. This was the true unease that Rockefeller's monopoly had awakened. Not that he had cheated or stolen in the traditional sense, but that he had revealed a path by which the rules of honest competition could be followed precisely, and yet the entire fabric of competitive possibility could still be unmade. And that revelation, once made, could not be forgotten. But efficiency, no matter how elegant, breeds fear in the hearts of those who watch from outside the fortress walls. And in the closing years of the 19th century, a question began to whisper through America's drawing rooms and printing houses alike. What happens when one company controls so much of the world's lifeblood that governments themselves become subjects rather than sovereigns? The very triumph that had made Standard Oil invincible began, paradoxically, to unmake it. For every refinery swallowed whole, every competitor bought at a fraction of its value or driven into ruin through relentless price pressure, a witness remained. A railroad dispatcher who remembered when Standard agents arrived with ledgers and ultimatums. A refiner's widow who watched her husband's life's work dissolved into another man's empire. A businessman in Oil City or Titusville who had refused to sell, had fought back with every tool at his disposal, and lost nonetheless. These people did not forget, and their stories, gathered like drops of rain, eventually found their way into the hands of those whose profession it was to tell stories to a listening nation. Journalism in the 1890s and early 1900s was undergoing its own transformation. Printing presses had grown faster, cheaper, more efficient. A new class of reporters emerged, younger and hungrier than their predecessors, trained not merely to report facts, but to investigate them, to dig beneath the surface of official statements and polished facades. They were called, with a mixture of admiration and contempt, the muckrakers, and they moved through American life like miners searching for ore beneath the social bedrock. Theodore Roosevelt, who would soon become president, both courted them and despised them, understanding that they wielded a power that could topple empires built of brick and capital. And among these seekers of hidden truth stood a woman of particular patience and precision, a journalist and writer named Ida Minerva Tarbell. Consider her for a moment as one must when the arc of a life bends toward consequence. She was born in the oil country of Pennsylvania, her father a small oil producer, and she had grown up watching the early chaos and promise of the petroleum industry. with the keen eye of a child born into that world. But her father too had experienced what many others experienced, the gradual, inexorable pressure of Standard Oil's expansion, the squeeze applied so carefully that it barely seemed like violence. She understood then, from memory and from witnessing, the human cost of this efficiency. By 1898, when Tarbell was already in her mid-40s and had proven herself a meticulous biographical journalist, she was approached by the editors of McClure's magazine with a proposition. They wanted her to write a history of Standard Oil, not a puff piece, not corporate biography, but a true history, where the pieces might fall where they would. It was, perhaps, the most consequential assignment in American journalism of that era, though neither Tarbell nor her editors could have known with certainty how the world would receive what she uncovered. What followed was a methodical excavation of records, interviews, court documents, and financial trails that would consume nearly 5 years of her life. She traveled to New York and Ohio, to the scattered offices and homes of men who had been absorbed into Standard Oil's machinery. She obtained stock certificates and partnership agreements. She traced the subtle movements of capital and the not-so-subtle movements of coercion, and gradually, with the patience of a historian and the eye of a prosecutor, she assembled what amounted to the most damning portrait of American business ruthlessness yet produced. The series began appearing in McClure's in November 1902, serialized month by month, and slow-burn revelation that no daily newspaper could match in either depth or reach. The effect was immediate and reverberating. Here, finally, was not rumor or speculation, but documented history, each claim footnoted, each allegation supported by evidence that Rockefeller's own lawyers could not easily deny. The public, which had benefited enormously from the cheap kerosene and refined oil that Standard Oil produced with such efficiency, found themselves confronted with a troubling paradox. The very mechanisms that delivered them affordable light had been built on the ruins of competitors. The same precision and control that had created an industrial marvel had been turned, quite deliberately, toward the elimination of rivals and the accumulation of power that no single corporation ought perhaps to wield. Newspapers picked up Tarbell's work and amplified it. Cartoonists rendered Rockefeller as an octopus, his tentacles wrapped around the nation's oil wells, refineries, railroads, and the very mechanisms of government itself. The image was powerful, and it oversimplified, as such images do, but it captured something true about the concentration of economic power. One must note here a certain irony that likely escaped no one. The very democratic mechanisms of free press and public debate, once ignited, created a momentum of their own. Tarbell had not called for regulation or trust-busting directly. She had simply laid bare the facts and allowed readers to draw their own conclusions. But conclusions were not slow in coming. In the halls of Congress, in the offices of ambitious politicians, and especially in the White House, where Theodore Roosevelt occupied the presidency with his characteristic thunder and vigor, the Standard Oil question had become impossible to ignore. Roosevelt, a Republican of the progressive strain, believed that the massive accumulations of capital that had grown up in the decades following the Civil War had begun to threaten the very democracy they lived within. He did not oppose business, but he opposed the corruption of democracy by business, the sense that a few men in a few offices could bend the machinery of government to their will. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been on the books since 1890, but it had been enforced sporadically and often unsuccessfully. What Tarbell's revelations provided was not new legal tools, but something almost more powerful: public will. The American people, reading her serialized investigations in their parlors and passing the bound collections from hand to hand, had begun to understand that Standard Oil was not merely efficient, but predatory, not merely large, but dangerous. And that understanding, once kindled, became a political force that could not be extinguished by lawyers or lobbyists or even the considerable resources of Rockefeller's empire. Between 1906 and 1911, the machinery of government, spurred on by public outcry and the ambitious determination of prosecutors and sympathetic judges, ground slowly toward a reckoning with Standard Oil's dominion. It was not a swift process, for nothing involving the highest reaches of American commerce and law ever is, but it was relentless. And as the legal momentum built, Rockefeller himself, now an elderly man who had largely withdrawn from direct involvement in the company's operations, watched with a mixture of resignation and perhaps something approaching philosophical acceptance. He had built his empire on the principle that nothing was permanent, that capital must always be in motion, always flowing toward new opportunities. Perhaps he understood, in the quiet hours, that empires, like all things, must eventually give way to what comes after. The legal machinery that had been grinding for years finally reached its crescendo on a cool May morning in 1911, when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and must be dissolved. It was, in many ways, the inevitable conclusion to a saga that had been building since the turn of the century, when journalists like Ida Tarbell had exposed the company's practices to an increasingly scandalized American public. And yet, standing at the threshold of this supposed ruin, John D. Rockefeller found himself in a position that could only be described as paradoxical, almost as if the universe had delivered him a riddle wrapped inside his greatest defeat. To understand the strangeness of what happened next, we must first sit with the scale of what Standard Oil had become by that point. The trust had grown so vast, so deeply woven into the American economy, that it controlled somewhere between 80 and 90% of all oil refining in the country. It was not merely a company, but a kind of shadow state within the state, moving money and influence through channels that ordinary citizens could barely perceive. The court's decision to break it apart was supposed to restore competition, to unleash market forces that had been strangled under monopolistic control. It was supposed to punish Rockefeller and restore balance to an economy that many believed had become dangerously lopsided. But here is where the narrative takes a turn that still puzzles historians and economists more than a century later. When Standard Oil was dismantled by judicial order, it was separated into 34 separate companies. Each of these companies, theoretically, would compete with one another in a newly liberated marketplace. And Rockefeller, who still owned his substantial stock holdings in the original trust, found that he now possessed proportional shares in all 34 of these new entities. In other words, the very mechanism designed to break his power had instead distributed his wealth across a diversified portfolio of oil companies that, almost immediately, began to prosper in the newly competitive environment. Here lies the irony, soft and almost poignant in its way. The breakup of Standard Oil, rather than impoverishing Rockefeller, had actually enriched him. His fortune, which stood at approximately $900 million at the time of the dissolution, began to grow more rapidly in the years that followed. Why? Because competition, paradoxically, could be more profitable than monopoly for someone who was already at the top. The separate companies could pursue new markets with renewed vigor. They could innovate more freely. They could expand into new territories without the ossification that had begun to set into the massive, monolithic trust. And Rockefeller, as the principal shareholder across all of them, benefited from this growth. One might pause here and wonder what this tells us about power and its relationship to law. The legal system had identified a problem, diagnosed it correctly, and attempted a cure, and yet the patient seemed to recover in a manner that contradicted the intended outcome. Some historians have suggested that Rockefeller understood this possibility all along, that there was a kind of chess player's patience in his acceptance of the court's decision. Others have argued that it was simply blind luck, the universe conspiring to reward not virtue but shrewd positioning. The truth likely involves both threads. What followed the 1911 dissolution was a period of remarkable growth for the American oil industry as a whole. New discoveries in Oklahoma, in Texas, and beneath the deserts of the Southwest seemed to validate the theory that breaking up Standard Oil would unleash economic dynamism. The separate companies competed vigorously, developed new extraction techniques, built new refineries, and expanded globally at a pace that might have been impossible under the old monopolistic structure. Standard Oil of New Jersey became what would eventually be known as Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became what we now know as Chevron. These companies, freed from the weight of the original structure, became titans in their own right. And Rockefeller, now in his early 70s, had achieved something remarkable. He had gone through what should have been a catastrophic legal and financial reversal, and emerged not diminished, but in a stronger position than before. His wealth had been legitimized, in a sense, by the Supreme Court's action. The court had not deemed his conduct criminal, had not imposed confiscatory taxes or fines, had simply ordered a restructuring. He had complied with the law, adjusted his portfolio, and continued to grow richer. It was a lesson not lost on observers at the time, and it remains a kind of cautionary tale even now, over a century later, about the relationship between law and wealth, between regulation and the adaptability of large fortunes. In the years immediately following the breakup, Rockefeller began to retreat from the public eye. The fierce, competitive drive that had animated his younger self seemed to soften. Perhaps he recognized that he had achieved something that transcended mere business success. He had become not just a wealthy man, but a symbol, a lightning rod for American anxieties about power and money. His name had become almost mythological, a shorthand for both ambition and moral concern. And perhaps, in the quiet way that such men sometimes do, he began to consider what a life of purpose beyond accumulation might look like. The Supreme Court's decision, meant to diminish him, had instead, through the mysterious alchemy of markets and time, made him richer still. The dissolution was enacted, the competition proceeded. American oil companies spread their operations across the globe, and John D. Rockefeller, who might have raged against the judgment or sought revenge, instead accepted it with a kind of equanimity that suggested he had seen further ahead than the justices themselves. Whether that equanimity came from genuine foresight or from a deeper recognition that wealth, once achieved at a certain scale, becomes almost immune to the weapons designed to constrain it, remains a question worth holding as we drift deeper into the stranger chapters of the Rockefeller story. The story might have ended there, in 1911, with Standard Oil broken into pieces, and John D. Rockefeller Sr., at 68 years old, officially retired from the company he had built. But something curious happened in the decades that followed. The man who had become synonymous with American greed, whose name appeared in newspaper cartoons as a bloated spider spinning webs of control, gradually transformed, or perhaps more accurately, was transformed by forces beyond his control. And much of that transformation fell to his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., a man born into unimaginable wealth, but forced to navigate its weight in ways his father never had to contemplate. John Jr. was a different creature entirely from his father. Where Sr. had been shaped by scarcity and hunger, groomed in the penny-pinching discipline of his mother and the cunning of his con-man father, Jr. grew up surrounded by abundance. He was educated in the best schools, exposed to art and culture, and perhaps most importantly, he was forced early to think about what responsibility meant when your name carried such gravity in a society increasingly critical of the fortune that bore it. The boy was born in 1874, when Standard Oil was already consolidating its stranglehold on American oil, and he came of age during an era when the excesses of the Gilded Age were beginning to invite serious moral scrutiny. By the early years of the 20th century, Junior had inherited not just wealth but a liability. His father's reputation was a weight he could not set down. The public image of John D. Rockefeller Sr., ruthless, cunning, a monopolist who had crushed competitors and enriched himself beyond any reasonable human need, had become toxic. And yet the elder Rockefeller, now in his 60s and 70s, seemed almost indifferent to this judgment. He played golf, distributed dimes to children, and seemed to believe that the righteousness of his business methods would eventually vindicate itself. It fell to his son to grasp what his father could not, that in a democracy, perception and power were inseparable, and that wealth without legitimacy would eventually invite not just criticism, but destruction. What happened next was neither purely altruistic nor entirely cynical. It was something more interesting, a deliberate, methodical construction of a new narrative around the Rockefeller name, accomplished through the systematic deployment of the family's resources toward causes the public deemed worthy. Some historians have called it the greatest exercise in reputation management in American history. Others, more charitably, have seen it as genuine evolution, a sincere turn toward public service. The truth, as is often the case, likely contains elements of both. In 1909, even before the Standard Oil breakup, John Jr. had begun to channel money toward a cause that seemed almost designed to repair his family's image: medical research and public health. He established what would eventually become the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, an institution that would attract the finest scientific minds in the world and fund investigations into diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. This was not charity in the Victorian sense, the distribution of alms to the deserving poor. This was something more systematic, more scientific, more thoroughly modern. And it was, perhaps most crucially, something that could not easily be dismissed as mere conscience washing. Good science conducted by good scientists produced results that were difficult to argue with. The Institute became a model for a new kind of philanthropic enterprise, one that did not merely respond to suffering, but attempted to understand and eliminate its causes. And as it took shape and began to produce real discoveries, something shifted in how the Rockefeller name was perceived. It began, almost imperceptibly at first, to accumulate associations not with ruthlessness, but with progress, not with exploitation, but with healing. The transformation was neither instantaneous nor complete, but it had begun. Then came 1913, 4 years before the final breakup order, when John Jr. undertook what many consider his most important philanthropic gesture. He established the Rockefeller Foundation, an entity designed to be far larger and more ambitious than the Institute. The Foundation's stated purpose was breathtaking in its scope: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Think for a moment about what that means. Here was a family that had built its fortune through ruthless consolidation and control, now creating an apparatus designed to distribute knowledge and resources across the entire planet. Whether motivated by genuine transformation or strategic brilliance, or both, inseparably intertwined, the effect was undeniable. The foundation was structured to outlast the individuals who created it. It would have trustees, boards of directors, professional staff. It would operate according to principles of scientific inquiry and rational planning. And it would have money. Not the kind of money that circulates through markets and generates returns, but the kind that sits in endowment, generating a steady stream of resources, decade after decade, century after century. This was wealth converted into permanence, fortune transformed into institution. It was perhaps the grandest expression of the Rockefeller impulse toward control, reimagined as a mechanism for influencing not competitors or markets, but the entire trajectory of human knowledge and health. What's striking, when you sit with this history for a moment, is how it upended the simple narrative of ruthlessness. If Standard Oil had been the expression of John Sr.'s genius for efficiency and control, The foundation became the expression of his son's understanding that efficiency and control could be deployed toward different ends. The methods were not so different. The same attention to detail, the same capacity to think systematically about large problems, the same drive toward consolidation and organization. But the objects had changed. Instead of controlling oil supplies, the Rockefellers were now, in effect, attempting to organize global knowledge in service of human betterment. Instead of squeezing competitors, they were pooling resources with other philanthropists, universities and governments toward shared aims. And here's the subtle thing that made it all work. It was genuinely difficult to argue against. When the Rockefeller Foundation decided to fund medical education, to establish research institutes, to send experts into disease-ridden regions to study and attempt cures, these were not acts that invited the kind of moral scrutiny that monopoly had invited. You could criticize Standard Oil for what it was, but how do you criticize the eradication of disease? How do you question an organization dedicated to spreading knowledge? By the early 1900s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had begun to understand something his father never fully articulated, though the elder man sensed it instinctively. Wealth, when it reaches a certain mass and volume, becomes less a possession and more a force. It flows, it accumulates pressure, and unless it is given deliberate direction, it becomes a weight that bends a family downward under its own gravity, crushing rather than lifting. So it was that in 1913, as his father approached his 70s and the courts circled ever closer to dismantling Standard Oil, the younger Rockefeller made a choice that would reshape the family's entire trajectory. He would create a vessel, a foundation, a new kind of instrument for directing the family's wealth, not inward, toward mansions and ledgers, but outward, toward the improvement of mankind. It was a stroke of genius, or perhaps necessity wearing the mask of generosity. The Rockefeller Foundation was established with an initial endowment of $50 million, a figure almost incomprehensible when rendered into the currency of the time. To put it another way, it was roughly equivalent to the annual revenue of many nations, and it arrived into a world that was desperate for intervention. The years following the turn of the century had brought a curious collision in human knowledge. Science was beginning to unlock the mechanisms of disease at the cellular level, yet that knowledge remained largely confined to laboratories in Europe and the Eastern universities of America. Meanwhile, across the South, across Latin America, across Africa and Asia, tens of millions of people labored under the burden of illnesses that were entirely preventable, treatable, or eradicable. Yellow fever plagued the Caribbean. Malaria killed with industrial efficiency across tropical zones. Hookworm, that small parasitic worm that had been identified only a few decades earlier, infected the poor of the American South. Often undiagnosed, always debilitating, creating generations of lethargic, pale children who seemed simply born weak. And everywhere, tuberculosis moved through cities and towns like a patient predator, taking the young and the beautiful with a kind of aesthetic cruelty that had inspired poets and devastated families for centuries. Into this landscape, the Rockefeller Foundation entered not as a charity, but as something closer to a strategic force. Its leaders understood that money alone could not cure disease. What was needed was knowledge, infrastructure, training, systems. The transformation of isolated, scattered brilliance into coordinated networks of research and action. From its offices in New York, the Foundation began to map the global burden of illness with the same methodical precision that John D. Sr. had once applied to oil refineries and railroad routes. One of the first great campaigns was directed toward hookworm, a disease that the Foundation's leaders, particularly Frederick Gates, had identified as a kind of keystone ailment. Remove hookworm, and suddenly, populations that had seemed chronically weakened would revive. Productivity would increase. Schools would fill with alert, vigorous children. So between 1909 and 1915, before the foundation was even formally established, the International Health Commission, a Rockefeller-funded precursor, fanned out across the American South, the Caribbean, Central America, and eventually into Africa and the Mediterranean. They trained local health workers. They conducted mass treatment campaigns. They educated communities about sanitation and the transmission of the disease. And they kept meticulous records, introducing into public health what had previously been the domain of private industrial management: quantification, measurement, benchmarking. What was remarkable about this effort, and what set it apart from the charity work of previous eras, was its systematic nature. This was not about providing aid to the suffering. It was about identifying a problem, scaling a solution, and demonstrating its effectiveness in terms that were irrefutable. It was, in essence, the Rockefeller method applied to the human body and the human condition. The success with hookworm opened a broader vision. If a parasitic disease could be targeted and substantially reduced through coordinated international effort, what else might be accomplished? The Foundation's leaders began to think of disease not as acts of God or natural human frailty, but as problems with solutions. Tuberculosis, for instance. The disease had been decimating populations for centuries, yet by the 1900s, sanatoriums, preventive measures, and dietary interventions had begun to show results in wealthier populations. Why couldn't that knowledge be spread? Why shouldn't a poor farmer in Poland or a mill worker in Japan have access to the same understanding? This philosophy gave birth to what became the Foundation's most ambitious undertaking in its early decades: the creation of a network of schools and institutes dedicated to medical education and research in regions where such institutions barely existed. Consider this for a moment. Before 1913, if you lived in most of Latin America, or much of Asia, or the less developed regions of Europe, the prospect of obtaining a rigorous, science-based medical education was essentially impossible. Medicine was learned through apprenticeship, through folklore, through trial and error accumulated over generations. The Rockefeller Foundation decided to change that. It would fund the establishment and support of medical schools, first in China, then in Brazil, then spreading outward in a careful sequence of strategic placements. These were not charitable enterprises. They were investments in creating the infrastructure of modern medicine where it had never existed before. That distinction matters. In China particularly, the Foundation's influence became profound, and to some observers, troubling. By 1915, the Foundation was supporting the establishment of a medical school in Beijing affiliated with a union of mission institutions, which would eventually become Peking Union Medical College, an institution that would train generations of Chinese physicians and establish in that country a beachhead of Western medical science. The irony, or perhaps the tragedy, depending on one's perspective, was that this expansion of medical knowledge occurred in the context of foreign domination and colonialism. The Foundation was not operating in a geopolitical vacuum. It was extending American influence, American epistemology, American methods of organizing knowledge and the body into regions where different traditions had prevailed for millennia. Was this enlightenment or imperialism? Was it the liberation of human potential or the subtle conquest of other ways of knowing? These questions were never directly posed in the Foundation's own literature, but they hung in the background, unacknowledged but present, like humidity before a storm. Education became another pillar of the Foundation's work, though here the intent was somewhat different. The Foundation did not seek to establish new universities wholesale. Instead, it functioned as a lever. It identified institutions of promise in the United States and abroad, schools that had intellectual ambition but lacked resources, and offered strategic grants. These grants came with subtle conditions and expectations. The money was never quite free. It came with the assumption that the recipient institution would modernize, would strengthen its scientific offerings, would bring its methods into alignment with the most rigorous international standards. In this way, the foundation became a kind of invisible architecture underlying the shape of higher education across much of the world, not dictating, precisely, but guiding, not commanding, but incentivizing. The effect was that by the 1920s and 1930s, if you aspired to be trained at a serious medical school, a university of genuine standing, you would likely find yourself studying according to principles and methods that had either been directly funded or subtly influenced by Rockefeller money. The questions you would learn to ask about disease, about nature, about the organization of knowledge itself, all of these had been shaped, to some degree, by the strategic vision of a family that had made its fortune in oil. The Foundation's support for scientific research operated on a similar logic. In the 1920s, as physics was undergoing its greatest revolution since Newton, as quantum mechanics was being born in European laboratories, the Foundation provided sustained financial support that allowed research to continue during periods of economic uncertainty. It funded fellowships that sent the most promising researchers across borders and oceans. It supported the establishment of institutes, dedicated temples of inquiry really, where brilliant minds could gather and think without the immediate pressure to generate practical results. Some of this research would eventually have profound practical application. Some would remain forever in the realm of pure knowledge, useful not because it cured diseases or built bridges, but because it expanded human understanding of reality itself. But here too, there was an unspoken assumption embedded in the Foundation's choices. The research being supported was research being conducted according to Western scientific methods, within institutions shaped by Western models of organization, asking questions framed within Western intellectual traditions. The diversity of human knowledge systems, the insights that might emerge from other cultures' understanding of nature and the body, remained largely outside the scope of Rockefeller philanthropy. By the 1930s, the Foundation had become something unprecedented in human history. It was not a government, yet it operated in nearly every nation. It was not a corporation, yet it had the resources and strategic focus of any large multinational enterprise. It was not a religious institution, yet it had the missionary zeal and global reach of the great churches. It was, instead, a new kind of actor on the world stage, a private entity wielding public influence, directing resources according to principles of efficiency and evidence, but principles that were themselves shaped by particular cultural assumptions and particular historical moments. The Foundation had money, in other words, and money is always more than neutral. Money is vision made material. Money is choice crystallized into institutions and structures that persist long after the chooser has turned to dust. And the Rockefeller Foundation, in these early decades, was making choices that would reverberate through the 20th century, that would shape how disease was understood, how knowledge was organized, how human progress itself would be imagined and measured. As the Depression descended over the world in the 1930s, while breadlines formed and fortunes evaporated overnight, the Rockefeller Foundation continued its patient work, continued its deliberate expansion of medical knowledge, continued its strategic placement of institutions designed to improve the human condition. And somewhere in the gap between genuine altruism and strategic self-interest, between enlightenment and influence, the Foundation found its peculiar peace, its quiet justification, its sense of purpose that would shape the 20th century in ways both visible and invisible, ways that are still being traced and understood and debated today. The portrait of medicine in the American South at the turn of the 20th century was not one that made headlines in the newspapers of the North. In the red clay soil of rural Georgia and the humid swamplands of South Carolina, a small parasitic roundworm, called Necator americanus, had settled into the bodies of millions of people without fanfare or recognition. The hookworm lived in the intestines of the poor and the sharecroppers, the tenant farmers and the children who walked barefoot through contaminated earth. It fed quietly on the blood of its hosts, year after year, draining them of iron and energy and the simple capacity to work. Doctors of that era called it the germ of laziness, a phrase that reveals more about the prejudices of the medical establishment than it does about the disease itself. The hookworm did not announce itself with sudden fever or visible sores. Instead, it whispered its presence through chronic anemia, through the slow diminishment of a person's strength and will, making entire populations appear sluggish and diminished in ways that observers at the time misunderstood as moral or racial failing. This parasitic silence might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a chain of events that began with a single scientific curiosity and ended with the birth of organized global public health. The discovery that hookworm was endemic to the American South came not from a southern physician, but from a northern one named Charles Wardell Stiles. In 1902, working in a laboratory in Washington, Stiles published his findings with a clarity that could not be ignored. The disease was preventable, it was treatable, and its presence in the South was not a mark of inherent regional deficiency, but rather a problem of sanitation and poverty that could be systematically addressed. The response from the South was curious. Some embraced the news as liberation from an unspoken shame. Others resisted it, as if admitting to the disease was admitting to backwardness. But to John D. Rockefeller Jr., now coming into his own as the inheritor of the Standard Oil fortune, and as a man searching for a way to transform raw wealth into something that might matter beyond accumulation, the hookworm question presented something extraordinary. It presented an opportunity not merely to do good, but to demonstrate that scientific medicine, properly funded and organized on a vast scale, could reshape human health across entire populations. In 1909, with the advice of his team of philanthropic advisors, John D. Rockefeller Jr. established the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the eradication of hookworm disease. The name was unwieldy, but the ambition was crystalline. It was the first time in American history that private wealth had been deployed on such a scale toward a specifically medical and social goal. The commission sent teams of doctors and public health workers into the rural South with a mandate that was both practical and symbolic. They would diagnose, they would treat, and in doing so, they would educate. They would teach mothers about the importance of shoes and outhouses. They would demonstrate to farmers why privies needed to be built away from wells. They would establish treatment clinics in small towns that had perhaps never seen a trained physician before. The work was meticulous and often quiet, lacking the glamour of hospital construction or the visibility of a great laboratory. Yet, in its own way, it was revolutionary. It assumed that disease was not the province of the body alone, but of the entire ecosystem in which a body lived. It assumed that the poor could be educated, that communities could be changed, that prevention through science and infrastructure was possible. The Sanitary Commission's campaigns took shape across the Deep South and into the Caribbean and Central America. Between 1910 and 1914, they examined more than 1 million people, treated hundreds of thousands, and distributed millions of doses of thymol, the drug of choice for killing the parasite. But the numbers, large as they were, tell only part of the story. What mattered more was the shift in consciousness they represented. For the first time in the United States, a systematic attempt was being made to use scientific knowledge and organized wealth to eliminate not just individual cases of disease, but the conditions that created disease. This was not charity in the traditional sense, where the wealthy dispensed assistance from on high. Rather, it was something closer to what would later be called public health, a recognition that disease in one place could affect everyone, that poverty and illness were connected, that science and systems thinking could address problems that seemed insurmountable. The hookworm campaigns required no moral judgment of those afflicted. They required only an understanding of parasites, and of water, and of soil chemistry. In that simplicity lay something profound. By 1915, the Rockefeller Foundation, now established as the formal vehicle for the family's philanthropic ambitions, had taken the hookworm lessons and begun to think at an even larger scale. What if the same approach that had worked in the rural South could be applied to other diseases in other places? What if tuberculosis, malaria, yellow fever could be approached not as inevitable scourges, but as problems amenable to solution through organized science and money? The foundation began to fund medical research institutions, to establish schools of public health, to send researchers and doctors to tropical regions where diseases flourished in the heat and humidity that Americans at the time associated with exoticism and danger. Rockefeller Foundation researchers would eventually help to control malaria in the Mediterranean, would work on plague in India, would send expeditions to South America to track yellow fever to its source. In the process, they essentially created the modern field of public health as a distinct discipline. Before Rockefeller money, before the Sanitary Commission, public health existed mostly in the minds of a few visionaries and in the fragmentary efforts of local boards of health. After the Rockefellers took up the cause, it became a science with institutions, with training programs, with a clear logic and methodology. Universities that had never had departments of public health began to establish them, often with Rockefeller Foundation grants as the seed. Young doctors who might have simply hung out a shingle in a prosperous city began instead to think about how disease moved through populations, about how water systems could be engineered, about how knowledge could be disseminated to prevent rather than merely cure. The hookworm itself, that small parasite that had fed unnoticed on the blood of millions, became a gateway to a new way of thinking about human health. There is something worth pausing on here, in the quiet hours before sleep. The story of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission and the Foundation's early medical work is a story in which immense wealth accomplished something genuinely good, something measurable, something that reduced human suffering. Hookworm disease declined in the South, not because of any inherent improvement in the condition of the poor, but because a wealthy family decided to fund its eradication. Public health became a discipline and a profession because Rockefeller money created the institutions that trained its practitioners. The question of whether such outcomes were possible, whether a system built on vast private accumulation could generate outcomes that served the broader public good, seemed, in the early decades of the 20th century, to answer itself affirmatively. Yet the question itself contains within it a gentler one that might be worth holding as you drift towards sleep. When good outcomes emerge from enormous concentrations of wealth and power, are we left simply grateful for the good, or does there remain a trace of discomfort about the structure that made the concentration possible in the first place? The hookworm was eradicated, yes, but it might have been eradicated more quickly, or more thoroughly, or with greater equity in the medical knowledge produced, had the wealth that funded the effort been distributed differently from the start. The Rockefeller Foundation's public health campaigns saved lives and changed the course of medical history. And yet the question of what other health campaigns were not funded, what other diseases were not addressed, because Rockefeller money flowed towards certain priorities and not others, that question too belongs to the history, even if it is a question we cannot fully answer. The 1920s had passed in a kind of golden haze for those with the means to see them that way, and John D. Rockefeller Jr., now firmly in command of the family's vast machinery, had become something altogether different from his father. Where the senior Rockefeller had been a creature of accumulation and control, Jr. was a creature of transformation and legacy. He had begun to see wealth not merely as something to be guarded, but as something to be shaped into monuments that would outlive the man himself. The Rockefeller Foundation was flourishing, its reach extending into every corner of scientific inquiry and social improvement. Medicine, education, agriculture in distant lands, all bore the quiet imprint of Rockefeller capital. It was as though he had decided to spend his way into the history books through the side door of philanthropy, letting his father's monopolies fade into the textbooks while he rebuilt the family name in the currency of human welfare. And then came the autumn of 1929. The stock market collapsed like a house built on fever dreams. Fortunes that had seemed as permanent as the bedrock of Manhattan simply evaporated. Banks failed. Unemployment surged toward catastrophic numbers. Breadlines formed. Families lost their homes. The entire American economy seemed to be circling some invisible drain, and the uncertainty that flooded through the streets was the kind that made people question everything, whether the system itself was broken, whether capitalism had spent itself like a man with a borrowed fortune. It was into this moment of national despair that John D. Rockefeller Jr. made a decision that seemed, to many observers, almost insane. He would build, not retreat, not hoard, not wait for the storm to pass, build. The site was 3 blocks of Manhattan real estate in the heart of Midtown, between 5th and 6th Avenues, land that had once housed the old Metropolitan Opera House. Rockefeller had acquired the lease years earlier with vague intentions. Now, with the nation gasping for breath in the Great Depression's grip, he decided to transform it into something magnificent. A city within a city, a temple of commerce and culture and human ingenuity, built not from the fever of speculation, but from the deliberate, patient capital of one family's accumulated wealth. Rockefeller Center, as it came to be called, would take more than a decade to complete. 14 acres of Midtown Manhattan would be torn down and rebuilt according to a unified vision. Multiple buildings would rise in terraced harmony. There would be theaters and galleries and broadcasting studios. There would be shops and restaurants and offices. There would be a public plaza, an ice skating rink in winter, a garden in summer, where ordinary New Yorkers could come free of charge and feel themselves part of something grand. It was not charity, precisely. The complex would be profitable, the offices would be leased, the rents would flow back to the family. But it was something deeper than simple commerce. It was a statement that said, "We believe in tomorrow. We believe in this city. We believe in human endeavor and creation even now, when everything is collapsing." The Depression deepened through the early 1930s. Unemployment reached unprecedented levels. President Hoover seemed paralyzed by his philosophy of self-reliance. And yet, day after day, at Rockefeller Center, construction continued. Cranes swung steel beams into the Manhattan sky. Hundreds of workers found employment in the building trades. The project became, almost accidentally, a kind of monument to faith in the future. Passers-by could watch the towers rising, while the rest of the city seemed to be descending into chaos. What did it mean that the Rockefellers were building while others were losing everything? Was it callous? Was it visionary? Or was it something more complex than either? A demonstration of confidence that was itself a form of stimulus, a way of moving capital through the economy at a moment when capital had nearly stopped moving altogether. There is an oddly American quality to the Rockefeller Center story, something that speaks to the way wealth and optimism have always been tangled together in this country's imagination. To be rich, in the American mythology, is not merely to accumulate, it is to build, to leave something behind that is bigger than yourself, more beautiful, more lasting. And in the depths of the Depression, when the future seemed genuinely uncertain, when many of the wealthy were consolidating and hiding and hoping the storm would pass, the Rockefellers chose instead to create employment, to sponsor art and culture, to bet on tomorrow. The Radio City Music Hall, the centerpiece of the complex, opened in December 1932. Its interior was a symphony of Art Deco geometry and opulence, with a grand staircase and soaring ceilings and everywhere the sense of deliberate, expensive beauty. The opening night was attended by thousands. The sheer grandeur of it, after years of economic contraction and despair, seemed to exhale something that the nation needed. Here was proof that the future might still hold magnificence. Here was proof that human beings could still create beauty even in darkness. Or perhaps, depending on your perspective, here was evidence of breathtaking inequality, a family spending fortunes on luxury while millions struggled to feed their children. Both things were true. And this paradox, that the Rockefellers were simultaneously doing genuine good and embodying the concentrated power that many Americans had come to fear, would trail them throughout the Depression and beyond. The center would eventually become beloved, a tourist destination, a place of genuine civic pride. Generations of New Yorkers would have their first skating experience on its rink. Children would gaze up at the gilded sculptures. Couples would meet beneath its arches. It would become, as architecture sometimes does, almost invisible in its familiarity, simply part of the city's skeleton, the air everyone breathed. But in those early 1930s, as the steel frames rose against the grey sky and the bread lines continued to snake around the corners, there was something almost defiant about it. What does it mean, you might wonder, for one family to maintain such absolute faith in their own permanence, such certainty in their ability to shape the world around them, even as that world is falling apart for everyone else? There is generosity in it, surely, but there is also a kind of isolation, a confidence that can only exist when you are so far removed from ordinary suffering that the depression, however real, however devastating, remains somehow external to your own life. The Rockefellers, in their insulated world, could afford to think long-term. They could afford to build. And perhaps that itself was the point. Perhaps the very act of building when others were afraid was the statement Rockefeller Jr. wanted to make. The future will come, we will shape it, and we will do it beautifully. The Depression would eventually pass. The center would stand for generations, bearing witness to a moment when one family decided that the answer to economic collapse was not retreat, but creation. By the time the Supreme Court's gavel fell in 1911, John D. Rockefeller had already begun the quiet work of stepping back. He was in his 70s, impossibly wealthy, and perhaps sensing what historians would later confirm, that an empire built on consolidation and control could not survive a world that had decided consolidation itself was the enemy. But wealth, once gathered into such magnitude, does not simply vanish. It transforms. It flows like water finding new channels. And in the Rockefeller case, it flowed downward through the generations, pooling in the ambitions and choices of 5 remarkable men who would inherit not just money, but the weight of a name that had come to mean almost everything American capitalism could be, both its ingenuity and its excess. John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only son, had already begun that transformation toward philanthropy, as we have traced. But he was not alone in his generation for long. By the 1940s, his 5 sons, the grandsons of the oil magnate, were reaching adulthood in a world utterly transformed from their grandfather's ruthless emergence. These young men, each born into incomprehensible wealth, each educated at Princeton or other Eastern institutions, each aware that the name Rockefeller could open any door, or, perhaps, create an obligation to walk through some doors they might otherwise have avoided. They were David, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and Jay. 5 brothers, 5 radically different interpretations of what it meant to inherit a dynasty. Consider the curious fact that in many wealthy families, the eldest son becomes the steward of tradition, the keeper of the family's established path. But the Rockefellers seemed to move by a different logic. Nelson, the second son, was the political animal, driven, charismatic in a way that seemed almost mercurial compared to the austere precision of his grandfather. He possessed an appetite for power that was not primarily economic. He had inherited sufficient wealth, but political, social, architectural even. Nelson wanted to shape not just markets but the physical and cultural landscape of America itself. He studied economics at Princeton, served in the military during the Second World War, and then entered public service with the kind of energy that suggested he had been waiting his entire life for permission to do so. David, the third son, gravitated toward finance in a manner that felt almost inevitable, as if the banking world had been waiting for a Rockefeller to arrive and complete some unfinished design. He became deeply embedded in the operations of Chase Manhattan Bank, but in a way quite different from how his grandfather had once dominated oil. David's influence would be quieter, more intricate, less about visible control and more about deep networks of relationship and subtle leverage. He would come to know presidents, prime ministers, and financiers across the globe, but where Nelson sought the spotlight, David seemed to understand that true power often prefers the shadows. Then there was Lawrence, the fourth son, who developed a fascination with conservation and the preservation of natural spaces that speaks to a sensibility quite at odds with the extractive logic that had built the family fortune. It is perhaps fitting, or perhaps ironic, one might say both, and both would be true, that one of the Rockefellers became devoted to protecting the very landscapes that oil wells had scarred and reshaped. Lawrence acquired vast tracts of land in places like the Virgin Islands and Wyoming, established nature preserves, and invested in early ventures that we might now call green technology. He was not the public figure his brother Nelson was, but his influence on how Americans came to think about wilderness, about the possibility of reconciling wealth with conservation, was profound. Winthrop, the fifth son, carved a different path still. He was drawn to Arkansas of all places, which itself seems like an act of independence, a refusal to remain locked in the orbit of the Eastern establishment. He became a rancher, invested in business ventures in the South, eventually served as governor of Arkansas, and seemed to inhabit a world somewhat apart from the concerns that animated his brothers. He was, in some sense, the least famous, the least documented, yet his life speaks to the ways that inherited wealth, even in almost unimaginable quantities, cannot fully determine the shape of a person's choices or the arc of their ambitions. And then Jay, the youngest son, who took on significant roles in educational institutions and family philanthropy, working somewhat in the shadow of his brother's more public trajectories, yet essential to the ongoing machinery of the Rockefeller Foundation and the family's broader project of influence through giving. What emerges from the divergence of these five brothers is perhaps an unexpected portrait of wealth in the mid-20th century. They were not locked into a singular path, as one might have imagined. The dynasty did not present them with a rigid script they were required to follow. Instead, they seemed almost to divide up the domains of American power among themselves. Politics and the visible exercise of authority fell to Nelson. Finance and the invisible architecture of global economic influence fell to David. Stewardship of nature and the conscience of conservation fell to Lawrence. The assertion of independence and the cultivation of regional influence fell to Winthrop, and the custodianship of the family's vast charitable apparatus fell to Jay and others of his generation. Yet even as they dispersed their energies in different directions, there remained a kind of coordination, an implicit understanding that they were not simply five individual men, but nodes in a larger network. The Rockefeller family by the mid-20th century had become less a tight hierarchy centered on a single overwhelming personality and more a distributed system of influence. This was not weakness necessarily. In some ways, it was adaptation. The original Rockefellers' tight control of Standard Oil had become impossible in the modern world. Antitrust laws, regulatory agencies, and the general suspicion of concentrated corporate power had made that model obsolete. But if you could not control an empire through a single company, you could influence the world through multiple channels, through political office, through banking relationships, through conservation efforts, through the careful distribution of philanthropic capital. The empire had become invisible, disaggregated, more resilient in some ways precisely because it was no longer dependent on any single source of wealth or power. One might pause here and wonder what it means for a family to inherit not just wealth, but the expectation of shaping the world. Did these 5 brothers feel burdened by the legacy they had been given? Did they feel, at any moment, the weight of their grandfather's ruthlessness, the knowledge that their comfort and their opportunities had been built on strategies that the American legal system had eventually deemed intolerable? The historical record does not always reveal such inner doubts, but one detects, in the divergence of their paths, perhaps a tacit acknowledgement that the old way, the way of their grandfather, and even somewhat of their father, could not be replicated. They had to find new ways to be Rockefellers in a world that was no longer willing to tolerate Rockefeller-style oligarchy in its original form. By the middle decades of the 20th century, the Rockefeller name had begun to fragment and disperse across American life in ways the first John D. could never have anticipated. The fortune itself remained vast, but the family's political and social influence took on a different texture, no longer the grip of a single visionary, but rather a constellation of individual ambitions, each member seeking to answer the old question in their own way: what is wealth for? Among the 5 brothers who inherited the third generation's expectations, one in particular would step directly into the public eye and reach further toward national power than any Rockefeller before him. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, born in 1908, grew up in an atmosphere of deliberate preparation. His parents, John D. Jr. and the formidable Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, had constructed for their children a childhood designed not to spoil them, but to shape them. Nelson learned languages, studied economics and art, traveled extensively through South America as a young man in the 1930s, and returned home with an almost missionary zeal about Latin American development. Unlike his brothers, who seemed content to steward existing institutions, Nelson possessed an almost restless hunger to build, to persuade, to inhabit rooms where decisions were made. He was charismatic in a way that money alone cannot purchase, warm, direct, intellectually curious, in a manner that drew people to him rather than kept them at a respectful distance. In 1940, at the age of 32, Nelson moved into public service with an appointment as coordinator of inter-American affairs under President Franklin Roosevelt, a position that gave him both real influence and a national platform. Throughout World War II and beyond, he used that post to champion development programs, cultural exchange, and what we might now recognize as soft power in the Western Hemisphere. He understood instinctively that wealth and policy, influence and vision could be woven together, that a Rockefeller in government was not simply a wealthy man occupying an office, but a person with the resources and the networks to actually implement the ideas he championed. When Nelson turned his attention toward the governorship of New York in 1958, he entered the race as something more than a wealthy amateur seeking office. He was a tested administrator, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades moving between business, philanthropy, and government, and he possessed a vision of state government that was expansive, optimistic, and expensive. In an era before the complete transformation of American politics by television and mass media, Nelson's campaigns relied heavily on his personal appeal, his ability to move through communities, and make people feel that he genuinely understood their concerns. He won the governorship decisively, and then he won it again and again, serving for 15 years, from 1959 to 1973, and in doing so, transformed New York State in ways both visible and subtle. His tenure as governor was characterized by bold infrastructure spending, ambitious cultural projects, and a perhaps characteristically Rockefeller confidence that major problems could be solved through adequate funding and intelligent planning. He oversaw the construction of the South Mall in Albany, a modernist complex of marble and glass that some admired for its vision and others found cold and unnecessarily grand. He expanded state universities, funded public television, and supported the expansion of healthcare services across upstate New York. He was also a Republican during a period when the Republican Party was still capacious enough to contain both conservatives and moderates, and Nelson stood firmly on the moderate side, progressive on social issues, skeptical of radical change, convinced that intelligent capitalism and responsible government could work together rather than in opposition. These years as governor, viewed from a distance of decades now, seem almost dreamlike in their confidence. Nelson believed in expertise, in planning, in the capacity of government to improve lives through intelligent deployment of resources. The fact that he had access to personal wealth meant that he could afford to be generous with public funds, to pursue expensive visions without the constant anxiety about budget limitations that constrained most governors. Whether this made him a visionary, or whether it simply meant he had the luxury of not having to make difficult choices remains, perhaps, a matter of perspective. But it was his aspirations toward the presidency that come to mind when we consider this chapter of the Rockefeller story. In 1964, Nelson sought the Republican presidential nomination, running as the progressive alternative to Barry Goldwater, the Arizona conservative who seemed to many Republicans to represent a dangerous right-wing turn. Nelson campaigned actively, but 1964 was the year the Republican Party chose ideology over pragmatism, and Goldwater won the nomination. Nelson's moment seemed to pass, though he remained a powerful figure in New York politics. The presidency called to him again, more insistently, in 1968, when the Vietnam War and the turbulent year of assassinations, riots, and social fracture seemed to demand experienced, moderate leadership. But by then, the American political landscape was shifting in ways that would ultimately prove inhospitable to a man of Nelson's style and substance. The Republican Party was becoming more conservative, more focused on cultural questions and Southern politics. The counterculture and the civil rights movement had created a generational divide that wealth and sophistication could not bridge. When Nelson mounted his campaign in 1968, he was too late, too little connected to the emerging politics, and Richard Nixon claimed the nomination and then the presidency. By 1976, with Gerald Ford in the White House following Nixon's resignation, Nelson was appointed vice president, the second and final national office he would hold. But it was a consolation prize, a role of limited influence in a transitional moment. The presidency had receded beyond his reach, and with it went the sense that the Rockefeller family might produce a president, that they might claim that ultimate seat of power. It was a remarkable moment, really. A man of vast wealth, of real intelligence and experience, of genuine charisma and moderate convictions, who nonetheless could not quite ascend to the highest office in the land. One wonders, in those quiet hours before sleep, whether Nelson understood that his moment had been historically contingent, that the political moment that might have elected him had already passed by the time he truly reached for it. While Nelson's ambitions pulled him toward electoral politics, toward the spectacle of campaigns and the public eye, his younger brother David chose a quieter path, one that would prove perhaps more durable in its influence. David Rockefeller, born in 1915, inherited the same mathematical mind as his father and grandfather, but he directed it not toward monopoly or philanthropy alone, but toward something more diffuse and harder to name, the architecture of global financial networks. Where John D. had dominated oil and his son had cultivated universities and hospitals, David would come to understand that money itself, freed from a single product, could be the ultimate instrument of power. After his education at Harvard and the London School of Economics, David returned to New York in the 1940s with a conviction that the American banking system had grown too fragmented, too parochial. He joined the Chase National Bank, a respected but regional institution, as an analyst. Think of those early post-war years, when America was still learning to think globally, when the reconstruction of Europe was beginning, when international commerce was a frontier. David Rockefeller did not rush. He studied, he built relationships. He understood that a banker, unlike a politician or an industrialist, could operate almost invisibly while shaping the very channels through which capital flowed around the world. The bank itself underwent a transformation. In 1955, Chase National merged with the Bank of Manhattan Company, creating Chase Manhattan Bank, and David rose through the ranks with the kind of steady advancement that suggested both competence and family weight. By 1961, at 46 years old, he became Chief Executive Officer. Here is a curious thing to consider as you rest in the darkness. What does it mean for a member of one of America's wealthiest families to take the helm of a major commercial bank? It means that ancestral capital, family connections, and institutional power converge in a single person in a way that is almost immune to public scrutiny. Chase Manhattan became, under David's leadership, something more than a bank. It became a node in a vast network of American diplomatic and financial influence. David cultivated relationships with political leaders, with foreign ministers, with business titans across continents. He traveled constantly. He attended conferences. He spoke to power in the calm, reasoned language of finance, a language that bypassed the rhetoric of ideology and spoke instead in terms of stability, growth, mutual benefit. The Rockefeller name opened doors that would have been merely ajar for others. The Rockefeller wealth and institutions gave him credibility and leverage that money alone could not buy. In the 1950s and 1960s, a period when Cold War tensions ran high and American foreign policy was being shaped by military strategy and ideological competition, David Rockefeller represented a different approach, the soft power of capital. He believed that economic integration, that the ties of mutual profit and banking relationships could reduce the likelihood of conflict. This was not naive. It was sophisticated. It was also, one might observe, tremendously beneficial to those who controlled the channels of capital. But was it not also, in some genuine sense, a vision of a more connected world? David served as head of Chase Manhattan for more than 2 decades. During that time, the bank expanded its reach into Europe, into Latin America, into Asia. David himself became a kind of unofficial ambassador, a figure who could speak with presidents and prime ministers not as a supplicant, but as an equal, a man whose family had shaped the very infrastructure of American wealth. He was, in effect, one more thing the Rockefellers had become, a direct link between corporate finance and the foreign policy apparatus of the United States. This is where the story becomes more difficult to trace, more shadowed by the question of influence and its proper bounds. David Rockefeller did not hide his role. He was public about his views. He wrote, he spoke, he advocated. But there remains a curious opacity about the exact mechanisms by which a banker's vision shapes a nation's diplomatic choices. Did American foreign policy decisions reflect Rockefeller's philosophy, or did his philosophy align with decisions already being made elsewhere? The truth is probably that causality here is not simple or linear. It is instead networked, distributed across dozens of conversations and decisions, some of them documented, many of them not. In 1973, David Rockefeller founded the Trilateral Commission, an organization that would become something of a lightning rod for those interested in the hidden architecture of global power. The commission brought together influential politicians, bankers, industrialists, and academics from North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Officially, it existed to promote closer cooperation among these regions, to address shared challenges in an interconnected world. And this was true. but it also meant that men like David Rockefeller could, through the framework of a private organization, exert influence over policy discussions in multiple nations simultaneously, all with the patina of democratic discourse. Was this sinister, or was it simply the natural extension of capitalism and family power? The question hangs there, unanswered, the way many historical questions do when you listen to them long enough in the quiet hours. David Rockefeller was not plotting in a basement. He was not conducting secret experiments in control. He was instead doing openly, and with considerable charm and intelligence, what the wealthy have always done, using their resources to shape the world according to their vision. That this happened to align with American strategic interests, that it reinforced American financial dominance, that it benefited the Rockefeller interests themselves. These were features, not bugs, in the system he helped construct. His influence was real and broad, though always filtered through institutions and the language of expertise rather than announced through family decree. Chase Manhattan became the bank for American multinationals expanding overseas. David Rockefeller became a voice in discussions about development, about modernization, about the proper relationship between finance and foreign policy. The family's power, which had once been concentrated in oil, was now diffused throughout the financial and diplomatic infrastructure of the post-war world. And here, perhaps, we encounter the reason why the Rockefeller dynasty proved more durable than one might expect. Oil could be regulated and broken apart. Fortunes could be dispersed through generations. But access to power, woven into the fabric of institutions and relationships, proves far more resilient. David Rockefeller understood this intuitively. He understood that a seat at the table in boardrooms and government offices was a form of wealth that did not show up on any balance sheet, but was nonetheless real and transferable and enduring. By the 1980s and 1990s, David Rockefeller was elder statesman of global finance, a voice consulted on major international questions, a philanthropist and collector of contemporary art, a man who had taken the raw power of his grandfather's fortune and transformed it into something more subtle and in many ways more effective, had ruled through the direct control of an industry. David ruled through influence, access, and the architecture of institutions that spanned the globe. The rise and fall of Standard Oil had taught the family a lesson. Direct monopoly invites opposition. Distributed power, exercised through multiple institutions and networks, proves far harder to oppose or even to clearly identify. And as we listen to the particular shape of this influence, its quiet spread across decades, we might reflect on how power itself evolves, how it transforms its vessels, how it persists through forms that do not announce themselves as power at all, but instead as expertise, as networking, as the natural accumulation of relationships among the competent and the connected. This is the world that David Rockefeller built and inhabited, and it remained a Rockefeller world, though one that would soon begin to scatter as the next generations inherited not empires, but choices about how to spend time and attention in a world that no longer needed them quite so desperately. By the late 1960s, something subtle but irreversible had begun to shift within the architecture of Rockefeller power. The empire that John D. had constructed with such meticulous intent that his son had carefully stewarded and expanded, that his grandsons had inherited as a unified instrument of influence. This empire was quietly fragmenting, not through collapse or scandal, but through the simple and inevitable mathematics of inheritance and time. When a vast fortune is divided among children, and then among grandchildren, and then among great-grandchildren, each with their own convictions, their own marriages, their own sense of what wealth ought to mean, the center cannot hold as it once did. The family itself, you see, had grown exponentially. Where John D. had one son, and that son had 5 sons, those 5 had produced dozens of descendants, each with a claim on the family resources, each with a voice in how that legacy would be deployed. The structure that had once allowed David Rockefeller to move quietly through the corridors of the Chase Manhattan Bank to shape global finance through a single coordinated vision began to dissolve into thousands of smaller voices, each pulling in different directions. It was not a dramatic rupture. There were no public feuds, no contested lawsuits that reached the newspapers. Instead, it was the gentler tragedy of dispersion. Consider the vast fortunes that had accumulated. By the 1970s, the Rockefeller family's wealth, across all its branches, was estimated to exceed somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion, perhaps considerably more depending on how you counted it. But this sum was no longer managed as a single instrument. Instead, it fragmented into charitable trusts, into individual family foundations, into investment accounts held by dozens of cousins who rarely spoke and whose priorities could not have been more different from one another. One branch of the family became deeply invested in environmental conservation, another focused its energies on medical research, a third devoted itself to the arts, a fourth pursued political careers, or diplomacy, or business ventures entirely separate from the family's traditional centers of power. Nelson Rockefeller's death in 1979 marked one kind of threshold. He had been the most visibly powerful of the third generation, the one who came closest to consolidating family influence into personal political authority. After him, no single Rockefeller would command quite that same presence in the American consciousness. David, his younger brother, remained deeply influential in banking circles, but his power was by then the power of expertise and connection, rather than the mobilizing force that had characterized his grandfather's dominion over oil, or even his own earlier years reshaping international finance. And here is where the story grows genuinely poignant if you listen carefully to what was happening beneath the surface. The very success that had created such enormous wealth had also, in a sense, solved the problem that wealth is designed to solve. The family no longer needed to accumulate, to consolidate, to grow their fortune through ruthless mergers and strategic marriages. The money existed. It was simply present, like an inheritance of air or light. The question that began to absorb the family's consciousness was not how to get more, but what to do with what they had. And reasonable people, even reasonable wealthy people, disagree profoundly on that question. This dispersal was accelerated by changes in American law and in cultural attitudes toward dynastic wealth. The federal estate tax, which had been strengthened throughout the 20th century, meant that with each generation, a portion of the fortune would be claimed by the government. Wealthy families, including the Rockefellers, began to establish charitable trusts not merely from philanthropic impulse, though that too existed, but as a practical means of preserving capital while reaping tax benefits. The Rockefeller Foundation, established by John D. Jr. in 1913, began to function as a kind of holding tank for billions of dollars. By the 1970s and 80s, the foundation itself became, in a sense, a rival power center to any individual family member. It had its own trustees, its own staff, its own vision. The foundation's decisions about where to deploy its resources could now, in many cases, outweigh the preferences of any single Rockefeller. There was something almost mechanical about this dispersal, even as it was also deeply human. Each new generation felt a certain obligation to honor the family name and values, but each also felt the pull toward their own authentic convictions. Some younger Rockefellers began to question the very foundations of their fortune. How much of their wealth derived from practices that we might now regard as problematic? What did it mean to be born into such abundance in a world where so many had so little? These were not questions that had troubled the earlier generations in quite the same way. The very confidence and clarity of purpose that had characterized John D. Rockefeller, this sense that efficiency, consolidation, and rational organization were unambiguous goods, began to seem more complicated when filtered through the consciousness of descendants who had grown up during the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the environmental movement. Philanthropy itself began to shift its character within the family's hands. Where John D. Jr. had approached giving with a kind of Victorian sense of uplift and moral education, his own descendants sometimes embraced approaches that were more radical, more experimental, more willing to challenge existing power structures rather than working within them. Some Rockefeller money found its way into organizations that were deeply critical of capitalism itself, or at the very least, critical of the unregulated corporate capitalism that had built the family fortune. One might observe here, if we were to pause and reflect, a certain irony in this trajectory. The family that had perhaps more thoroughly embodied the ruthless logic of industrial capitalism had produced descendants who, by the 1970s and 80s, were deeply ambivalent about that very system. Meanwhile, in the business world itself, the Rockefellers' direct influence was waning. The oil industry that had been their original source of wealth was evolving rapidly. The great integrated oil companies that Standard Oil had become, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others, were now run by professional managers and boards rather than by Rockefeller family members. Some younger Rockefellers pursued careers in business or banking, but they were rarely at the helm. The family was becoming, in a very real sense, more rentier than captain. They owned pieces of vast enterprises, but they did not command them. They enjoyed the fruits of those enterprises, but they did not shape their direction in the way that earlier generations had. The question of family unity, too, became increasingly fraught as the decades passed. The institutions that had once bound the family together, the regular meetings of family trustees, the shared assumption about how wealth should be deployed, the sense of a common Rockefeller project, these began to feel less binding. Cousins did not necessarily know each other well. Some did not know each other at all. The network of obligation and shared identity that had once held sway gradually loosened into something more like polite distance. Family gatherings became less frequent, less central to anyone's life. Some branches of the family drifted into different social circles, different regions of the country, different modes of being altogether. This was not, it bears noting, a pattern unique to the Rockefellers. Wealthy dynasties have fragmented across centuries and cultures. The centrifugal force of inheritance is powerful and relentless. And yet, in the case of the Rockefellers, there was something particular about it. They had been so thoroughly unified, so completely bound together in a shared vision of power and purpose, that their gradual dissolution felt like a historical event. It was as if the 20th century itself had been holding its breath, waiting to see whether such a concentrated accumulation of wealth and power could remain centralized indefinitely. The answer, delivered quietly and without drama across several decades, was no. And yet, even as the machinery of industrial influence slipped quietly from the family's hands, something else began to crystallize. Something that would prove far more durable than oil wells or railroad bonds or the intricate architecture of corporate power. The Rockefellers, it seemed, had learned a singular lesson from their century of scrutiny and reform, that lasting influence might be purchased not through control of markets, but through the careful stewardship of culture itself, through art, through land, through the slow, patient work of healing the world. Consider for a moment the Museum of Modern Art in New York, an institution so woven into the fabric of American cultural life that it is easy to forget it did not always exist. When Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, wife of John D. Jr., stood in a modest townhouse on West 53rd Street in 1929, just as the stock market was beginning its terrible collapse, she did something quietly revolutionary. She gathered a small group of women around her, patrons, collectors, people of taste, and she said, in effect, that American culture needed a different kind of temple, not a mausoleum of old masters or Renaissance paintings, though those had their place, but a living, breathing, democratic space where the art of this very moment could be seen, studied, understood, where a working person or a student or a curious child might walk through the doors and stand before a Picasso or a Matisse or a photograph that spoke to the present age. The family poured resources into this vision with the same methodical precision that John D. Sr. had once applied to refineries. They acquired buildings, they hired curators, they assembled collections, and the museum grew into something that transcended any single family's patronage. It became a cathedral of modern consciousness, a place where Americans could see themselves reflected in the mirror of contemporary art. The Rockefellers did not own MoMA in the end, but they had midwifed something that outlasted their ownership, that continued to evolve and question and inspire long after the last Rockefeller trustee had stepped away. This impulse toward cultural stewardship rippled outward into other domains. There was the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum, enriched by Rockefeller donations and curatorial vision. There were the careful acquisitions of Asian art, African sculpture, decorative objects of extraordinary delicacy that found their way into public institutions rather than private vaults. Even Kykuit itself, that great house overlooking the Hudson, eventually opened its gardens and rooms to the public. A slow, gentle transformation from the fortress of private wealth into something like a museum of how one family lived, thought, and saw beauty. And then there was the land itself. The conservation movement, so often associated with Theodore Roosevelt and the Sierra Club, found in the Rockefellers a peculiar kind of patron, one with deep pockets, but also, increasingly, with a genuine conviction that some parts of the natural world ought to remain untouched by development. Lawrence Rockefeller, one of the five brothers, became almost obsessed with this idea. He traveled to the American West and beyond, identifying landscapes that seemed to him to possess a quality of sacredness, of irreplaceability, and he did something that, in retrospect, seems almost impossible. He bought them, not to develop them, not to extract resources from them, but to give them away, to the government, to conservation trusts, to the future. The Grand Teton National Park, that serrated line of mountains rising from the valley floor in Wyoming, exists in its present form partly because Lawrence Rockefeller quietly purchased land adjacent to it and donated it to expand the park's boundaries. The Virgin Islands National Park, a sprawl of tropical forest and coral reef in the Caribbean, was preserved through his vision and his money. Countless smaller parcels, nature preserves, bird sanctuaries, areas where the only commodity being extracted was beauty and silence. All of this was purchased and set aside by a man who could have chosen, instead, to build ski resorts and luxury hotels. One wonders what his great-grandfather would have thought of such a use of capital. Probably that it was foolish, certainly that it was inefficient. But there is something almost noble in that inefficiency, is there not? In the choice to use power not to accumulate more power, but to hold something constant, to say no, to protect. The Rockefeller Foundation itself, created by John D. Sr. as a structure through which his fortune could do good work in perpetuity, evolved into something genuinely transformative. It was not perfect, no institution of such scale and influence can be, but it supported medical research that saved millions of lives. It funded the Green Revolution, the development of high-yield crop varieties that pulled billions of people back from the edge of starvation. It sponsored the work of anthropologists and sociologists and public health officials who were trying to understand human problems at a scale that seemed almost biblical. The foundation's spending was not always wise, and reasonable people disagreed, and still disagree, about whether this kind of philanthropic approach, concentrated in the hands of a single family's ideological descendants, was the right model for social change. But the fact remains that the foundation sat at the table when decisions were being made about human welfare, and it generally pushed, in its measured and methodical way, toward more knowledge, more health, more equity. There is something curious that happens when you examine philanthropic legacies across time. The original motivation becomes almost invisible. The oil that funded the art museum fades from memory. No one walks through MoMA thinking about Standard Oil refineries. No hiker climbing into the Tetons thinks about the Rockefeller banking empire. The money becomes invisible, absorbed into something larger than itself. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was the final, most sophisticated version of the Rockefeller strategy. Not to create dynastic monuments with the family name emblazoned across them, but to create institutions and preserved spaces so useful, so beautiful, so essential to human flourishing that they would endure independently of their origins. To make themselves, in a sense, unnecessary. The American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Museum of the City of New York, the cloisters in Manhattan with its medieval gardens and artwork, all of these bear some mark of Rockefeller patronage, some infusion of Rockefeller capital at a crucial moment. But they do not belong to the Rockefellers now. They belong to the public. They belong to children who will never know the family's name, to artists and scholars and dreamers who use these spaces as springboards for their own visions. And in that dispossession, in that willing surrender of ownership, there is something almost like redemption. The family that once seemed poised to own everything learned, eventually, that the most profound ownership is no ownership at all. This is a sleep documentary closing. No labels, no calls to action. Pure narration dissolving towards sleep. 7,143 characters of flowing, meditative prose on impermanence, wealth, memory, and Kikuit's quiet rooms at night establish the philosophical weight of a dynasty's rise and inevitable fading. Soft questions, gentle reflections, end as a listener drifts. And so the great wheel turns, as it always does, carrying fortunes and names and the weight of consequence through decades and then centuries, and what once seemed permanent as stone becomes, in the end, a kind of story we tell ourselves about time. The Rockefeller dynasty rose with the velocity of oil itself, a liquid force transforming an entire nation, reshaping economies and industries and the very structure of power in ways that still ripple beneath the surface of modern life. Yet empires, no matter how meticulously built, no matter how carefully constructed to endure, cannot hold against the slow and patient tide of change. The fortune that once seemed infinite, dispersed across generations and causes and competing visions of what wealth should become. The industrial monopoly that once commanded fear and awe, dissolved into 100 separate pieces, each one still vast, still influential, yet never again the unified force that could move mountains or remake continents. What becomes of power when it is finally loosened? This is perhaps the quietest question history ever asks, and the Rockefeller story whispers an answer in the language of philanthropy and art and conservation efforts that will outlive the original oil wells by centuries perhaps. The fortune did not vanish. It transformed instead into something more diffuse, more difficult to name or hold, a foundation dedicated to advancing human knowledge, museums filled with carefully curated masterpieces, national parks and preserved lands where wilderness still breathes. These are the monuments that remain when the industrial machinery has cooled and fallen silent, when the names of the competing oil barons have faded into the dimness of history books, when the railroads themselves have become themselves relics and memories. There is something almost tender about contemplating what a great fortune becomes when its accumulator is gone. The ledgers that John D. Rockefeller kept so meticulously, those carefully entered figures that tracked every penny with the precision of a man who understood that control lived in the details. Those ledgers are no longer read by anyone living. The keen eye that scanned them has been dust for more than a century. The hand that held the pen has long since returned to the earth, and yet the structures built with the wealth those ledgers represented still stand. They shelter people. They educate them. They preserve knowledge and beauty that might otherwise have been lost to time's gentle erosion. Consider the nature of legacy itself, that strange inheritance that passes from generation to generation in forms that shift and change and become almost unrecognizable from their origins. The grandson of a peddler who wandered upstate New York with tonics and opportunity became the progenitor of a family whose name adorned hospitals and universities and research centers across the globe. His descendants argued about the proper use of inherited wealth, some embracing politics and public service, others retreating into banking and finance, still others turning toward conservation and the preservation of natural beauty. Each generation inherited not just money, but also the question of what to do with it, how to bear its weight, what obligations it carried. Some bore that weight with grace, others struggled beneath its pressure. A few rejected it entirely, seeking different paths and smaller fortunes built on their own terms. What does wealth mean once it has accumulated beyond the point of personal pleasure or comfort? Once a man has everything he could possibly desire, once his houses are filled with masterpieces and his land stretches across entire valleys, what then becomes the point? The early Rockefellers seemed to understand, through trial and error and the slow accumulation of experience, that wealth must eventually become something larger than itself. It must transform into an instrument of influence that reaches beyond the individual, beyond even the family, into the broader fabric of how a society functions. This is not to suggest altruism in its purest form, for the Rockefellers understood better than most that philanthropy is also a form of power, a way of shaping the world according to one's vision. But it is to acknowledge that something in the human spirit, confronted with immense resources, tends eventually toward a desire to leave something of lasting value. Imagine, if you can, the halls of Kikuit as the evening settles over the Hudson. The great house sits on its promontory, surrounded by carefully tended grounds and views that must have seemed, to those who lived within it, almost like the world itself bending to their will. But a house is ultimately only stone and wood and glass, isn't it? Only a temporary shelter against time's slow dissolution. The artwork within those walls, the paintings and sculptures that cost millions to acquire, that represented the finest human creativity across centuries, will eventually outlast the family that collected them. The gardens, so carefully designed and maintained through decades of dedicated labor, will eventually return to something wilder and less controlled, as gardens always do when the hand that tends them grows tired or distracted or passes into memory. There is a peculiar irony at the heart of great wealth. It cannot prevent the accumulation of years. It cannot hold back the aging of the body or the dimming of the mind. It cannot purchase immortality, though perhaps it can purchase a kind of extended memory, a way of lingering in the world even after the life that earned it has ended. The Rockefeller name lives on, not primarily because of the oil that built the fortune, but because that fortune was eventually transformed into structures and institutions and preserved spaces that continue to serve purposes long after the original purpose, the accumulation of capital itself, has become almost irrelevant. Perhaps this is what the dynasty teaches us, in its slow unraveling and transformation into something gentler and more diffuse. That power, in its purest and most durable form, is not something that can be held indefinitely by a single person or even a single family, that it must eventually distribute itself, must find new vessels and new expressions, must become something that the original accumulator would perhaps not fully recognize. The boy who kept meticulous ledgers in a Cleveland counting house could never have imagined that his name would someday be remembered most clearly, not for the oil empire he built, but for the foundation established in his name, for the diseases eradicated through careful scientific funding, for the knowledge advanced through generations of research enabled by inherited wealth. The rooms of Kaikouet at night grow quiet in a way that no occupied space can ever fully be. There is the creaking of old wood settling, the whisper of wind through carefully preserved gardens, the subtle sounds of a house that has stood for over a century, that has witnessed births and deaths, and the slow passage of human lives through its corridors. The paintings hang in darkness, no longer lit by the careful attention of curators or the wondering eyes of visitors. The collections sleep, as it were, in their appointed places, waiting for the light of morning to reveal their colors and forms again. And somewhere in that darkness, you might almost imagine, there lingers some subtle presence of the lives lived there, the decisions made within those walls, the vision of permanence that motivates any person or family to build so carefully, so deliberately, so certain that this time, this structure, this accumulation of beauty and value will somehow endure forever. But it does endure, in a manner of speaking, transformed into something unexpected. The fortune fractured but did not disappear. The name faded in certain contexts but brightened in others. The industrial empire dissolved, but the philanthropic reach extended further and deeper into the life of the nation and the world than the oil wells ever reached. This is perhaps the truest measure of the Rockefeller dynasty, not the oil that once flowed from Pennsylvania wells, not the railroads that once connected the continent, not even the vast fortunes that once accumulated in single hands, but the slow, patient distribution of wealth and influence toward purposes that outlive the families and institutions that channel them. Rest easy, then, knowing that the wheel turns, that fortunes pass, that even the greatest accumulations eventually become something other than themselves. The Hudson Valley holds its secrets. The great houses stand and fall, and stand again in different forms. The names echo through generations until they become almost mythical, almost abstract, like the idea of wealth itself, divorced from any particular person or moment in time. And in the quiet rooms of a great house at night, surrounded by the collected beauty of ages, there is perhaps a kind of peace in understanding that nothing we build is truly permanent, and that perhaps that impermanence is not a failure, but rather the inevitable and gentle way of all things that pass from one hand to another, from one generation to the next, from one vision of what the world should be to another, forever dissolving and reforming like the patterns of shadows and light in the rooms where memory sleeps.